Okay. Hi, everyone. Guess we'll start on time. Welcome. My name's Thad Pawlowski. I am making noise with the microphone. I'm the managing director of the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes here at Columbia University. And today we're going to talk about climate impacts in New York City and our responses to them. We have 5 different presentations and covering a range of topics. I'm going to kick us off by talking a little bit about a seminar I just taught with urban planning students where we read this book, The Power Broker, which is said to be like the best book about New York City. It's a biography of one person, Robert Moses. You've probably heard of them. And it's been 50 years since this book was written. And so there's been a lot of work over the last year or so to take stock of what we've learned from this incredible tour de force of journalism and depiction of New York City in the first part of the 20th century and what we can learn from it. So I'll just talk for about 10 minutes about this. Just slide. Okay. My students and I wanted to read this book together because Robert Moses' legacy looms large in the city. And 50 years on, we can see when this was written 50 years ago, Robert Caro, this brilliant author, said, we've got to wait until evening to see what the full impact of Robert Moses' life has been. Now we know that this legacy has created a lot of the climate vulnerabilities that we experience in our neighborhoods. It was estimated at the time this was written that he displaced about 500,000 people through the construction projects that he did around the city. But that has left intergenerational impacts of housing insecurity for many communities throughout the city. He's also built so many highways and parking lots that he buried whole ecosystems under concrete, erasing biodiversity and creating the urban heat island effect. Moreover, the car-centric mode of urban planning that he adopted locked the greater metropolitan area into a pattern of fossil fuel dependency, both by the land use that the highways created and by the consumer model that was propagated by this car-centric culture. And then finally, and this is the thing that we probably focused on the most, was just how power is consolidated and used, and often how the stories of the powerless have been too often suppressed. And Robert Caro, again, does a great job. It was cool to read this book with the students because I feel like journalism is also under attack right now. And this is just like such a brilliant tome of journalism. Like he interviewed hundreds of people, went through countless papers. This kind of journalism we need in the world so much right now. This kind of radical truth telling. So, but the big thing was that we used Robert Moses to talk about some of the authoritarian currents in our society today. Like, who talks like this? Like, this is going to be the biggest bridge, the highest bridge, the best bridge ever. It was just kind of a proxy for understanding some of the narcissistic, egoistic leadership in our society today. Also used it to talk about local climate impacts in our neighborhoods, like Red Hook. We could talk about so many different New York City neighborhoods to understand Moses's impact. But in Red Hook, there's a concentration of public housing in the flood zone, which is cut off from the rest of the city by the Gowanus Expressway, and a lack of investment in transit has led to lack of access to jobs and economic opportunity. So Robert Moses moved more earth than any person alive, according to Robert Caro. And you can see, just for example, in the Great South Bay, how this impact, this is 1925, Nassau County, Great South Bay, before Robert Moses's program of highways and parks. And here it is just a few years later. What an incredible transformation by 1955, really supplied the fuel for urban sprawl. And this is just a zoom in of the Southern State Parkway and how these patterns of land use have left an indelible impact on the whole region. So Robert Moses came to power by working on things that everybody loves, parks, but he failed to grasp the local needs of communities and also the particularities of ecosystems, what we might call today ecosystem services. Robert Carroll does a great job of describing ecosystem services without using that language. And so he had like kind of a singular model of what parks could be in the world. And I think we can learn from, I titled this talk Reversing Robert Moses. How can we kind of use that model of developing parks now to question how we develop parks in the future? And I've been inspired by these high school students at the Washington Heights Exploratory Learning Academy who have this idea to turn the street in front of their school, which is right next to the Trans-Manhattan Expressway. So they suffer disproportionately from air pollution, urban heat island effect, and lots of conflicts with trucks coming off of the highway. And they say, why can't we turn the street into a park? And that's just what Paris is doing right now. Like, we are way behind Paris. Paris has this program of turning 250 streets all over the city into parks. Great opportunity for New York now. Also, there's an incredible episode in this book in 1929. How many people have read this book, by the way? Has everybody read this book? Has anybody? About 10. That's good. And it's a great book. Anybody read it twice? Yeah, Eric. Eric, how many times? 3?
Twice, and I listened once.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. It's worth reading twice because there's just like these incredible scenes. Like 3 months after the stock market crash in 1929, Robert Moses stood up in front of the ballroom at Roosevelt Hotel or not Roosevelt, some big fancy hotel, Waldorf or something, and showed this map of like what we're gonna do to re-envision our economy. And it was like this highway map, this great, like, we're gonna just crisscross the region with highways. And it was like this burst of optimism in the darkest days of the Depression. And he didn't know at that time and never really grasped that these highways he built like induced demand for more highways. And now those highways are falling down and we shouldn't rebuild them. We should just let them go.
Yes.
And we should think about other ways. Thank you. We should think about other ways to connect our city. There's a great image from Susanna Drake of like how you could reuse that highway space as parks and infrastructure, or parks and housing in the future. Another thing that Robert Moses was sort of expert in his time was workforce development. He operated in the New Deal era and leveraged this, the WPA and the CCC to do all kinds of parks work and other kinds of highway construction work. We've got all these brilliant young people studying climate adaptation, like here in these rooms today, and in all the places where we teach or work. We need to invest in this workforce development today. I think New York City and cities like it could start resilience corps to put these people to work, making the kinds of climate adaptation projects that we need today. And it would be a great way to build capacity at the same time as contributing to the long-term resilience of the city. The other thing, Moses like sort of half-heartedly went into housing because that's where the money was. And but he did it at a big scale. He did everything at a big scale, like slum clearance, Title I, displacing whole neighborhoods to build towers in the park. And he did this in collusion with the finance industry, like the real underlying power of New York City that hasn't changed for 200 years, banks. And that collusion between Robert Moses and the banks really led to like the financial crisis of the 1970s in many ways. And we need to think about ways to leverage the finance industry to build our affordable housing sector. I don't know if anybody else was just in that insurance talk with the revolving loan fund, for instance, seed capital for a revolving loan fund. We should like tax these, these pied-à-terres in the sky on 57th Street, like a billionaire's tax on housing to seed a revolving loan fund to make the kinds of housing investments we need today. In conclusion, Robert Moses, like his last big project was the World's Fair in 1964, which was kind of like a very cynical view of the world, which was, like corporations and state power and, like General Motors and ExxonMobil and like, big corporations telling telling people about the future. I feel like he, we can learn from Moses that he accomplished so much. He moved more earth than anybody, but he wasn't a movement. Movements can also build. There's this point that Caro and lots of other people have made that only authoritarians can build stuff. I don't think that's true. I think movements can also build. And maybe we need like a new World's Fair, a new great coming together so that movements can be strengthened to be able to build the kinds of infrastructure we need in the future. So for my students and I, it's been important to learn about where we've come. We've made these sketches together to talk about how did we get to the climate vulnerability that we experience today. These patterns of extraction and exploitation have always been in our history, and they have led to the climate vulnerabilities that we experience today. And we can also learn from history to understand the values that can propel us into a better future. We can understand that we have a lot to build on in terms of appreciating each other, in terms of cultivating our ability to collaborate, and also to appreciate nature toward greater innovation and a more climate adapted future. So there's me and my students, a small class, which is wonderful. And my friend Karen Blondell, we walked around Red Hook together. And that is my talk about Robert Moses. Now I'd like, thank you very much. Thank you. And now I'd like to invite to the stage Chris Haight, absolutely. And he's going to talk to you. He's an ecologist at New York City Parks. Welcome, Chris.
All right, good morning, everybody. So yeah, I'm an ecologist at New York City Parks in our Division of Environment and Planning. First of all, I want to just shout out Karen Law and thank her. She really led the data collection for this effort, as well as my other colleagues here at Parks. So a little bit about New York City and New York City Parks. Almost half of the city is green space, and that green space is made up of landscaped and natural area. The natural area is generally made up of forests, wetlands, grasslands. And half of our wetlands and streams are actually in New York City Parks. So that's made up of freshwater wetlands, streams. But I'm going to be talking about our salt marshes. We have almost over 1,600 acres of salt marsh here in New York City that we manage. Oops. So just in case you don't know what a salt marsh is, it's a wetland on our coastline here in our temperate region. It can be regularly or irregularly flooded. And it's home to grasses that are specifically adapted to live in that environment. And why do we care about these places? They provide habitat for plants and wildlife, as well as many ecosystem services. And they're also opportunity, especially for New Yorkers, to get out into nature. These are actually photos of sites that we have here in New York City. So salt marsh exists in the intertidal zone, and it can persist there by naturally building up in elevation or accreting elevation by capturing sediment and accumulating plant biomass, which can allow it to keep pace with sea level rise. And as sea level rises, marshes can also migrate upland. So as the upland floods, that vegetation can follow that flooding upland. But here in New York City, those processes are limited by barriers of development and accelerated sea level rise. We know already that our marshes are struggling to keep pace with accelerated sea level rise here in the city. And it's a highly urban environment. There's a lot of infrastructure and development around these sites, so migration is very limited. So our marshes are vulnerable. And so at New York City Parks, we really need to think about how we can manage these migration areas. So we went after a grant from the EPA to do an assessment of our migration areas in the city. And so our questions were, where is this migration going to occur? What do these migration zones look like? And are there any management actions we can take to facilitate this migration now? And so we set out to characterize, essentially just get a baseline of these migration zones, looking at vegetation and soils. And these were across the city, these are in undeveloped adjacent properties to our wetlands. And they're made up of coastal forests, shrubland, and landscape lawns, as you can see here in the photographs in Edgewood Hill Park. And then we wanted to make site-specific recommendations for management. So we did this. We did a desktop analysis to identify and select some sites in the city, all on New York City Parks property. We used a sea level rise model, the sea level affecting marshes model, to identify areas with a very high likelihood of being flooded in the 2080s. And so here's a map showing that. The area in blue is existing salt marsh, and the area in red is that potential flooding area. This is a site in the Bronx. And so we selected 13 sites based on this analysis that are distributed across the city. They're in 4 different watersheds, essentially the Harlem River, Long Island Sound, Jamaica Bay, and the Arthur Kill in Staten Island. So we went out to all of these sites in 2022, and at each site we set out 3 assessment transects within this migration zone. And each transect, we went out and established the 0 point at that boundary between the marsh and the upland. And then it was a 30-meter transect that we split up into 3 different zones: the marsh, the transition area, and the upland. And then within each of these zones, we did subplots looking at vegetation as well as soils. Within a 1-meter buffer, we looked at the trees and tree health. And then we also did a larger buffer of 25 meters to look at site impacts or direct barriers to migration. So some key findings, which were really not surprising. We found that for vegetation, native species cover was really even across transect zones and watersheds, and was higher than other plant types. Phragmites australis cover decreased along the marsh to upland gradient. Phragmites is an aggressive and common salt marsh, or I guess wetland adjacent plant that we have in the city. And then other problem species increased also along that marsh to upland gradient. And for soils, we found that over half of the soils contained suspected fill. So those are, not natural soils, soils that were brought in and generally would contain, construction debris like concrete or asphalt. And we also found the water table was present in a quarter of our cores, which also decreased along that gradient. And for woody species, count and size of woodies increased as you went up the transect. And canopy decline was really just at 14% across all sites, and really didn't vary across the transect or across watersheds. So we also identified really 3 main site impacts and made general recommendations for those impacts. So here we have Phragmites or other problem species that were present in the migration zone, which you can address just by mowing that frag or removing those species. This is an example site in Jamaica Bay. And we can do that in-house. We have crews of gardeners that can go out and do this work. You can also do it with volunteers. So it's easy to do, but it is something that you might have to do in perpetuity or for a long period of time to be effective. And so we would probably prioritize areas that these plants are mixed in already with native species to be most effective. And then also I mentioned there was a lot of fill soils out there as well as debris. To address that, you would need to do debris and fill removal at these sites, which is much more intensive and costly and would require contractors. So this is an example in Pugsley Creek in the Bronx, where there was a shoreline that was, a remnant construction site with asphalt and concrete. We did debris removal with contractors and planted that site. Now it is salt marsh. So much more costly endeavor to address that. We also found some pathway conflicts, both paved and natural trails at sites, which you can address by installing a boardwalk or a punch-in, like you can see here at Udall's Cove, which we also do. We have a trails team that can do this type of work, but it can also be done with volunteers. So in conclusion, again, just to reiterate, migration is pretty limited in New York City. Out of the 1,000 acres of salt marsh that we assessed, we found about 250 acres of potential migration. And we did make site-specific recommendations at our 13 sites that I mentioned before, mostly, again, Phragmites removal and fill removal at a lot of these sites. And so our next steps with this work, we need to figure out what resources we need to do this management, prioritize sites, and then secure funding if we need it, certainly for that debris removal and fill removal. And then we're going to keep an eye on these sites. This was really a baseline data collection, so we'll see how they change over time, and then in 10 years, we'll recollect this data.
So up next, we have Eric Sanderson and Lucy. Lucy, what's the last?
Right.
Right.
So I'm going to start us off, and then Lucy will pick up, and then I'll finish out. So we're going to talk about blue zones, places in New York City that were wet, are wet, and will be wet in the future. For a climate conference, we haven't really talked much about the climate. So I just want to talk about why. Why do we care about this? It's because of this. This is the actual data about the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration from Mauna Loa. You can see it's gone up over the last, over the course of my lifetime, over the last 60 years or so. And you can see it going up and down because that's the seasonal greening and senescence that happens every year. And the consequences of this global pattern locally is increased temperature and increased precipitation. And these are the curves. And because increased precipitation doesn't fall evenly all year round, it falls in storms, as we know, rainstorms. And sometimes those rainstorms are more intense because there's more energy in the atmosphere, because the carbon dioxide is holding more heat. We get these cloudburst events where a month worth of rain can fall within 6 hours or so. The city has cottoned on to what's happening. If you read the series of resiliency reports over the last decade or so, you can see increased levels of worry and concern bordering on panic about what we're actually going to do about this. When Hurricane Sandy came, the message was, we're not going to retreat from our coast. We're going to come out stronger and more resilient. And by the time you get to the de Blasio administration and the new normal report, basically like, oh no, what are we going to do? We have a stormwater infrastructure, sure, but it was built, over 100 years ago in the 1890s, and 1910s, and 1920s, around the time some of the things that Thad was talking about. And the pipes are only so big, and they were sized for the climate at that time. And moreover, it's very, very expensive to change them. Most of them were put in as neighborhoods were developing as a result of the highways and so forth that Thad was showing. And that's what's created the New York City that we have today. But this isn't the way that Lucy or I think about this landscape. We think about it more like this, as a landscape of forests, a landscape of wetlands, a little bit more the way Chris was talking about, but not limited to New York City parks, which are 12% of the landscape, but actually 100% of the landscape. Human beings who are the native people, the indigenous people, use up maybe less than 1% of the overall landscape here. And moreover, we're a low coastal city. As you can see here, that's the Atlantic Ocean and the Hudson River estuary. And the reason it's trees here is because we have a wet climate. We have a climate that, on average brings about 4 inches of precipitation every month, all month long, right? So that's a very good environment for forests. And if you let that parking lot go and you don't keep driving cars on it, it'll become a forest again, because that's the climate and the soils of this area. Forests manage water in different ways than cities do. This is a diagram showing all the ways that forests move water. They can intercept water. They can lead it into streams and infiltrate it into the groundwater. But also trees are like huge straws pulling water out of the groundwater and back up into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. One of my colleagues at the Botanical Garden told me that on average, trees every year move 4 times as much water as the Amazon River on a global basis. So it's a really important factor. And it's very different than the way we've managed our cities. So we've covered them in rocks, basically, and cement and concrete and built environments. And then we've directed the flow, the runoff, into these drainage capture devices that are then supposed to take it to the treatment plant and then out to the sea. And so the water actually comes down, it collects faster because of these conditions, and then it has to be managed according to this. And the whole point is to get rid of the water as fast as possible through this one route, which is very different than the way nature would do it. And if you work out the hydrologic diagrams, you can sort of see this idea. When you have too much water in nature, what you get are streams. When you have too much water in the city, what you get are floods. So we think about this because we study the historical ecology of New York City, and I won't bore you with all the details, but we use very many maps and we digitize many of the factors, and we bring them together to create these sort of synthetic layers of what the past environment looked like, including what the topography of the city was, as you see here, which is a really fascinating document. It's both backward looking, you can tell stories of the long-term geologic history of the city, and it's forward looking in terms of the kinds of ecosystems that it predicted in the past. What Chris was talking about were the salt marshes, the intertidal zones, which are the light green areas on this map. But again, it just goes to the point that we live in a low coastal city, that the whole part of the reason we're here in New York City is because it's so close to the coast and because it's such a great place for water. And now we're sort of turning this around in a way that makes it seem like it's a disadvantage for us. Of course, that topography generated streams. This is a blow up of our reconstruction of the streams. Some of those streams were perennial, they were running all year long. Other ones were intermittent. Those are the dotted ones you see here that are following the watershed lines. And then you can see the freshwater marshes, which are the sort of stippled blue ones, and then the salt marshes, which are in green. And in this new book that'll be coming out next year, I write descriptions of all of these streams and ponds and so forth, and what happened to them. Another factor that's important in terms of thinking about water is the depth to bedrock in New York City, and this is still true. If you're putting in green infrastructure, which is designed to put water in the ground, then you need to have ground to put it in. And you can see this map is shown at the same colors as the digital elevation model I showed before. But it's showing how the bedrock here in Manhattan and in the Bronx and in the center part of Staten Island is much higher. It's very close to the surface. But everywhere else, the bedrock sort of goes down. There's some rock outcrops in very western Queens, in Astoria and Long Island City, and that's the edge of the bedrock. And by the time you get out to where JFK Airport is, the bedrock's 1,200 feet under the surface. So the rock of Queens and Brooklyn slants down, which then creates places for water to go, which is what you see here if we do the same kind of coloring, but for the water table elevations. This is about the groundwater. Where's the water? And you can see that underneath the coastal plain of Brooklyn and Queens is quite high, and of Staten Island, and where those former salt marshes were. So all of these factors are still in play, even though we built the city on top of them. And that has consequences where the water is going. And to tell you more about that, I invite my colleague, Lucinda Roy.
Thanks, Eric. So to help answer this question of where places in New York City are vulnerable to flooding because of this changing climate, because of the historic ecology, and because of the way our city is designed today. Yes. We tried to answer this question using this logic of if a place was wet in the past, so a wet historic ecology is wet today and is predicted to be wet in the future, then that is a place that we're calling a blue zone, or a place that is particularly vulnerable to flooding. So we divided the city up into blocks. We use atomic polygons, but they're essentially just city blocks divided on the center line of roads. And we used past, present, and future data. So this past data is our historic ecology data. We have marine, freshwater, and intertidal data here. So that's those streams, salt marshes, freshwater marshes, ponds, and even the marine water, dunes, beaches. In our present data, we have the 311 calls. So this is when people call into 311 and they say, my basement's flooding or the street outside is underwater. We used the DEP stormwater resiliency flooding scenario. So this is the moderate flooding scenario, precipitation with no sea level rise, so sea level of today, and FEMA's 1% or 100-year storm event, and this is a coastal event. And for the future data, we use, again, another DEP stormwater resilience model, but this time it's normal-ish, rain event with 2050 sea level rise. And we used their extreme flooding scenario, which is the 2080 sea level rise. And you can see in this map that this pattern of flooding in the streets from fluvial or rain flooding is starting to look a lot like the streams that Eric derived in the historic ecology. We also used FEMA's 500-year storm event. So this is a 0.2% probability of happening, and this is all coastal flooding. So we use this logic here. So for each block of the city, if that block overlaps with 10% of the area of a piece of wet or soggy historic ecology, and that same polygon overlaps with at least 5%, or sorry, 5 3-on-1 service calls, or 10% of the DEP model, or 10% of the 100-year floodplain, then that's a place that floods today. And if that place was overlapping the same percentages of those future pieces of data, and all three are true, then that is a blue zone and a place that we really need to look at when thinking about changing our city editing, whether we need, and will sort of help us think about whether we need to do this in a resiliency way or a mobility way. So it turns out that that is about 21% of the city that meets this criteria of past, present, and future. And we've divided the city up into blue zones, and we've named and numbered each one of them to try to help give practitioners a way to use the data. It's not super helpful to see the data as an individual city block because water doesn't care that it's just on a city block. So we decided to delineate these by watersheds, and we used the city's LiDAR data for the topography, and we used streams. We derived streams, which again look similar to the historic ecology, and 4 points along the coastlines and third and fourth order streams, and then divided up our watersheds like this and organized our blue zones, those blue zone blocks, into watersheds. Again, giving each one a name and a number. So each watershed could be handed off to someone to do some sort of resilience action. In total, there are about 540 of them named and numbered. That is, again, 21% of the city vulnerable to flooding in this, with this logic. And we divided these up into boroughs and then did some analyses over the total land area, the number of people, and the number of structures in these blue zones. So from that 538 total blue zones, that's 21% of land area in acres, 12% of people living in blue zones, that's more than 1 million, and 11% of structures, more than 100,000 structures vulnerable to flooding in New York City. Back to Eric.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is re-articulating the citywide summary. So the whole point of this is trying to get an idea of the scale of the problem, which is relevant to the question of this conference about managed retreat. So it's about 20% of the city, about 1 million people, 118,000 structures. That's a large portion of the city, right? The city has a program called Cloudbursts. There are currently 4 Cloudburst sites. We probably need 500 Cloudburst sites to make the city more resilient in the future. But sometimes people say, oh, you know, all of New York City is going to flood. It's low, it's coastal. I heard Eric say something. But that's actually not the case either. The parts of the city, at least for the next 100 years, which are high enough. But we need to be thinking about this at a landscape scale. It's not just about the places that are flooding. It's also about the places that aren't flooding. And, you know, in the sort of large scale kind of way of thinking, like, you know, like Robert Moses brought, we need to be thinking about the city and at that sort of way. This is not a problem government can solve on its own. It's something that also has to happen on private lands. And the whole point of doing, you know, flood mitigation in the blue zones, giving the water a place to go, is so that we don't need 50% of the city to flood, right? And if you look at the extreme flooding scenario, that 2081, it's quite extraordinary how much of the city, it's almost half of the city would be underwater in that instance. It's also important to say there's different kinds of flooding. And, you know, New York City was served by Hurricane Sandy as being a reminder of what a coastal storm surge surge could do to the city. Hurricane Ida in 2021 reminded us what an intense rainstorm event could do. But there's no reason we couldn't get both of those events at the same time. You know, a coastal storm with a lot of rain. And in that sense, our combined sewer system, which tries to bring water to the sea when there's not enough for the sewage treatment plants to manage, won't work because the tides will be up into those things. And that's the scenario. That's sort of the devastating scenario. We can get sort of a handle on this at the blue zones by looking at what's under the data. But what I want to leave you with is how. The water is going to go downhill. The water is going to go to the lowest places. The question for us, which is the reason we're all gathered here today, is how do we mitigate this? How do we manage this? And in my view, I think there are just some places that we've been living, you know, for maybe since the time of Robert Moses, that we won't be able to live in the future. And that's why we need to think about strategies for managed retreat and managed relocation. Thank you very much.
All right. Next we have Shibani, Debnath. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi everyone, I'm Shibani Debnath. I'm a hazard mitigation planner with Michael Baker International, but today I'll be talking about my thesis research, which was completed last year with Swim Coalition, a New York City based water advocacy group. And I'll be focusing on current stormwater infrastructure and policies in the lens of Southeast Queens. As we heard from the last presentation, New York City is a wet city. It's going to be a soggy city. And rain is not new to New York City, but intensity is. These are some of the pictures that were taken from Tropical Storm Ida and Tropical Storm Ophelia 2021 and 2023. And for reference, the sewer system of New York City can handle up to 1.75 inches of rain per hour, which is about a 3-year storm. And these storms at one point dumped about 6 to 7 inches of rain in 1 hour. However, for certain communities like Southeast Queens, which has been outlined in red to the in the map to the right, this is not new for them. They have been getting impacted by a lot of these flood events, as you can see in these 311 complaints from 2020 to 2010 to 2020. Also, looking into some of the past data and looking into the future data, we know that New York City was built over wetlands, so there are naturally forming high points and low points. So water will be traveling and there will be areas of flooding. But there's also projected increased precipitation days as well as increased intensity. So we know that New York City will continue to be a wet city. A lot of our current stormwater infrastructure has been shaped by the Clean Water Act, which required the city to be in a consent order with New York State that formed a lot of plans, permits, and programs, some of which has been showed in the screen. Green Infrastructure Program, which reduces discharge primarily and combined sewer overflows, long-term control plans that target specific water bodies in New York City, the Stormwater Management Program that addresses separate sewer programs, separate sewer areas, and then the Stormwater Manual or the Unified Stormwater Rule, which was recently released, that looks into aligning water quality standards and requirements in both combined and separate areas. However, if we look into this snapshot of policies, we see that water quality was primarily prioritized and not flood vulnerability. And if you look into the script map shown by Medium, we see where green infrastructure is being built in the city versus where flooding is actually happening. And we see that not always the data always correlates with this, which brings us to Southeast Queens. It is a very fascinating landscape as there are high points as well as extremely low points where areas will be flooded naturally. It is also an area that has both combined sewer areas as well as separate drainage systems. And it's also an area which was heavily redlined. And impacts of this redlining are seen through current other indicators, which where the neighborhood has low tree canopy, it has high heat vulnerability, as well as high flood vulnerability. Some of the guiding questions for this research was determining who is currently being served by New York City stormwater assets, highlighting the relationship of the socioeconomic systems with stormwater, and finding alternative funding mechanisms, as well as redirecting planning programs to areas that need the most help. Looking into Southeast Queens and who's currently benefiting from the current assets, we see a concentration of green infrastructure assets and combined sewer overflows. But if we overlaid them with redlined lots, there is barely any assets in them. And if we also look into low-income lots, as well as zip codes that are getting a lot of flood complaints, not that many green infrastructure assets that have been shown in the green dots here are being represented in this area. I do want to preface this by saying that the Green Infrastructure Program was created for looking into combined sewer areas. So it's not surprising to see that a concentration of them are solely in combined sewer areas. However, areas that are not being being served by stormwater assets are the ones that are getting a lot of flood vulnerability. And if we look into some other flood vulnerabilities, we know that this area has stormwater flooding, it has coastal flooding, as well as historic flooding, and it has strong surface terrain flows as there are very high points and very low points. So there are areas where in Southeast Queens where it will be naturally pooled. And if we put all this information through a raster analysis, we can easily see where those areas will be, where the darkest areas shows the most vulnerable areas. Now, work is being done at Southeast Queens, which is great to hear, specifically the St. Albany Cloudburst project, as well as some other right-of-way projects that is being led by DEP. And there's also talks about potential partnerships with schools, public housing, as well as right-of-ways. However, if we combine all this information with our vulnerability analysis, there's still some inland areas that have not been addressed yet, specifically with zip code 11412, that doesn't see any assets inside them at the moment. Identifying gaps in spatial data can inform how the next generation of policy will be shaped to manage stormwater. If we take a snapshot of all of the stormwater policy that has been done, we see that a majority of stormwater infrastructure is influenced by the Clean Water Act that prioritizes water quality for combined sewer areas. There are certain plans like the 2017 Cloudburst study, as well as the 2021 Stormwater Resiliency Plan that is starting to address and introduce conversations about flood vulnerability and flood risk. However, only a few of them are really looking into equity considerations and other related topics. So just to recap some key findings, we see that the impacts of segregation are seen through flood risk. We know that there are some current work being done in Southeast Queens. However, there are multiple inland areas where stormwater is not being addressed. And current plans and programs primarily address water quality as it is in consent order with the state. These findings led to a 4-step recommendation process where each step informs the next, with the first one being the creation of a stormwater vulnerability index. We do have a social vulnerability index as well as a heat vulnerability index, and DEP as well as other state agencies and city agencies have been working into other stormwater data sets. And last year from the VIA report, the flood vulnerability index was also released. However, the flood vulnerability index did not include stormwater as there are knowledge gaps with groundwater, and there were also model assumptions made for the current sets of maps that are being used by the DEP in their stormwater maps. However, we still need a stormwater vulnerability index, and a few data sets that can be included are shown in the screen, some of which independent researchers, as well as some city agencies are gathering information for. And this would be a great opportunity for city agencies, for technical consultants, as well as for advocacy groups to share knowledge from a science background, but also from experience as well. The second recommendation looks into prioritizing private properties through the Green Roof Tax Abatement Program. Just to update you where this program stands, it was renewed 2 years ago, and it's renewed till 2027. The priority district's abatement value increased from $10 to $15, which is a great win for those who want to get more profit from green roofs. However, if you look into that map on the left, we see that no community districts in Queens are part of the GRTA priority districts. A big reason for that is the selection criteria when this program was initially established was for heat severity and not flood vulnerability. Revising the program would include community districts in Queens, specifically in Southeast Queens, that is flood vulnerable. And this would also be an opportunity for private homeowners to look into green roofs. And why would this program be very successful in Queens? It's because Southeast Queens is a low-lying area. It is also an area with a high groundwater table. So green infrastructure might not always be the best solution or any other below grade green infrastructure. So solutions like green roofs would be an excellent case for this area. The third recommendation looked into generating stormwater revenue. Our current water bill is split between potable water consumption and then sewage and stormwater, which is billed as one. Why does this matter? Apartment complexes, they have high potable water use but low runoff. However, large properties like a Home Depot or Walmart parking lots, they're going to have low potable use but a high runoff. And they're not being charged for the runoff that they are creating during a rainfall. A lot of advocacy groups that have been shown in the screen are proposing a restructured rate model, which is separating the sewage and stormwater into two different components. So this would not be a new water rate that we'll be paying, but restructuring the existing one based on your property size. Making this change would upset large property owners. However, there are opportunities where other existing green infrastructure programs in New York City can be combined with this recommendation, like the Resilient New York City Partners that has been specifically designed for installing green infrastructure in large properties. And DC is already doing a similar program with their Smart Rivers program, where it discounts up to 55% of their stormwater free for large properties. Creating more revenue through this restructured bill would allow for not only more revenue for stormwater, but also it would increase the green infrastructure assets at a New York City level scale, but it will also reduce the amount of water that is being sent to the sewer treatment facilities. Lastly, the recommendation looks into advocacy. A just approach needs to address past harms and needs to prioritize investments in the areas that need it most. And one approach of looking into and addressing just approach would be addressing equity in terms of contextual, distributive, and procedural equity. These topics have also been explored in NPCC's report that was released last year. In the case of Southeast Queens, this would prioritize, or this would bring organizations like Eastern Queens Alliance that has been pivotal to this area into the conversation table, where they would be in conversations about vulnerability analysis, about investments, but there would also be space created where city agencies can continue to support organizations like Eastern Queens Alliance that is doing a very important role in their community of highlighting the current vulnerabilities, as well as educating the entire community on the current status of stormwater infrastructure and other environmental challenges. To recap, creation of a stormwater vulnerability index would help us find hotspots for stormwater. Investing in private properties through the Green Roof Tax Abatement Program will be beneficial in managing stormwater. Restructuring the water rate bill will help us create more stormwater revenue for the city. And strengthening advocacy relation would ensure that local knowledge is driving policy. This presentation was initially given a year ago in April 2024. However, since then, there have been a lot of changes. Rainproof NYC, a program that focuses on heavy rain, concluded its finding along with the VIA report as well as the NPCC reports. And my understanding is that findings from all of these 3 reports will be integrated in the next generation of city plans. Most recently, DEP also released its stormwater analysis, which highlighted 86 locations for stormwater resiliency projects, with Southeast Queens getting a few of them. So I'm really happy to see that this area is getting the investment it needs. So with that, I would like to conclude this presentation. Thank you, everyone.
And our final presentation is on Zoom from Ruili Zhu from Tahaku University.
Yeah, sure. And while I get that set up, there was a question from somebody in the audience. If you wanted to ask that one.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, there was a question for Shibani. From what you've observed, what are the challenges and opportunities for private homeowners, neighborhood associations, and working together with DEP and other city agencies to expand? Yeah. Maybe you wanna, maybe, hold on, we'll start with that when we have our discussion after. So you get a chance to think about it. Okay.
Quick question while you're building that up.
Okay, we'll add another question. Yeah, sure.
I was curious about the terminology of blue zones. How did you choose the term blue zone? Is it like a softer way to present it to the public?
Yeah. Just trying to say something that makes sense to your average person.
This thing. So it's too about.
Really, can you try to share, please?
Let's change.
I have shared my screen. Can you see? Excuse me?
Yeah. Oh. It's not.
I think I'm sharing the screen.
I see the presentation there.
There. Okay. So let me.
Maybe replace the current share with
Oh, try again.
See, there's an option.
If you make her a co-host, that usually works. Then she does.
We're in webinar form, so that might not be. So can you go into the participant and make her a co-host?
By that.
Thank you. It's a village.
Yeah. So let's do. Well, yeah, so I think the folks online can see it. For some reason, we can't see it. Yeah.
Ah.
Right, yes.
All right.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we're at your attention, so please go ahead. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you so much. And hello everyone. I regret that I cannot, I'm unable to attend the conference in person and have to present remotely from Japan. However, the title of my presentation is Assessing the impact of disaster mitigation policies on housing recovery and flood adaptation. And first, as we know that due to global climate change, flow frequencies and severity are rising, driving up recovery costs. In the US, repetitive flows demand resilient solutions. Two key strategies for the flow mitigations are home elevations, which is to raise homes above base flow elevations for at least 1 foot of freeboard for structures in the 100 years flow plain. And another is buyout. And buyout is a New York State program to purchase properties that must remain undeveloped in perpetuity. And then, however, while flow mitigation programs effectively reduce future flow losses, their real-world impact and accurate implications remain underexplored. First, there are growing concerns about unequal access to mitigation. For example, in buyout programs, vulnerable groups defined by housing tenure, socioeconomic status, and race often face barriers that limit their ability to benefit from these policies. However, for elevation programs, the disproportionate effects of the groups have received least discussion. And second, while previous studies have found that buyout programs can depress surrounding property values, the neighborhood effects of elevations remain largely unknown. And lastly, since New York's 2013 flood resilient case amendment, which introduced new zoning regulations to promote flood resistance building designs, many homes have been elevated, often at considerable expense. However, there's little research comparing property values of elevated and non-elevated homes. So these studies seek to fill these gaps by examining the accurate and neighborhood impact and also the cost of the elevation focus on mitigation programs. Finally, it's aiming to inform more equitable and financially surround disaster policy decisions. And for this study, we decided to select New York City as the case, as the areas has been affected by a hurricane more than a decade ago and have developed buyouts and elevation programs since then. Importantly, there were no major storms after Hurricane Sandy, so I can analyze recovery and mitigations without new flood disaster interference. And while these studies areas bordering New York City, mitigation efforts, particularly buyout and elevation, were concentrated in flood-prone zones known as special flood hazard areas. As known in this figure, the new assigned special flood hazard areas highlighted in red are based on the 2015 preliminary flood insurance rent maps and largely covered areas inundated during Sandy. Since this research relays only public available data, the analysis is limited to the census traits that overlaps the special flood hazard areas. This ensures consistency when extracting buyout and elevation data. As policies implementations were mainly concentrated in these areas, for analysis, I also use housing transaction data and demographic data on the ACS. Now, regarding how build-outs and elevated property or properties were identified due to the policy restrictions, we do not have direct access to a list of homes that participate in build-out or elevation programs. Instead, we infer likely cases using open source dataset and the following methods. For the buyout properties, which will be used as a comparison of results, identified using map-plot land to use data. Isolate parcels where residential land was converted to vacant land and remained vacant in 2020 as IL data. However, elevation properties were identified using two sources. The past study elevation counts for the construction and demolition records. And homes are selected if records including keywords indicated elevation work after sanding. And another data is about the complete elevation data. These are from the 2020 building elevation datasets. Homes with homes with first floor at least 1 foot above base floor elevations are included. However, each method has trade-offs. For the post-sandy elevations dataset shows time information from at least some cases. Another one covers all the elevated homes, but lack of the time information. And in this session, based on the three core research questions, I conduct three analyses to explore both the equity of mitigation, implementation, and its economic impacts. First, use complete elevation data to examine whether mitigation efforts are equitably distributed across communities with different levels of social vulnerabilities. The year 2013 census data was used, assuming that most residents made mitigation decisions shortly after the disaster. And second is to analyze price differences between elevated and non-elevated homes to assess the direct effect of mitigation on property value. And finally, use data from 2013 to 2018 to study the impact of mitigation methods on nearby housing prices over time, especially in areas with varying levels of vulnerability. And in this session, I will present the results for the three analyses. And first, regarding the equity analysis, all build-out and elevation programs show similar patterns. As shown in the table, the variables highlighted in blue indicate significant negative coefficients. This means that these variables increase the number of the mitigation methods implemented decreases. For instance, the first line shows the areas with a higher proportion of residents aged 65 and older tend to have fewer buyout and elevation projects. In summary, areas with larger senior population and higher incomes or higher poverty rates or more renters shows no significant tendencies to adopt either mitigation strategy. The only notable differences between the two places appear in length of residence. Areas with a higher proportion of short-term residents are more likely to choose build-out over elevations. This suggests that hazard mitigation policies may not disproportionately affect communities of color. However, there may be barriers to implementations among renters, highlighting challenges in reaching this population group. And next, on the direct financial impact of elevation, using a matching method, I create a sample with approximately a 2-to-1 ratio of non-elevated to elevated homes, controlling for housing characteristics and flow exposure. The regression results shows no significant price differences between elevated and non-elevated homes based on the 2023 transition data. This outcome may be explained by two key factors. Over a decade after Hurricane Sandy, flood risk awareness may have faded about home buyers. Although elevation involves a high upfront cost, it does not appear to translate into higher market value. This finding suggests that despite the risk reduction benefits of elevation, the housing market does not reward these methods with a price premium. And finally, I would like to present the findings on how the impact of mitigation measures on nearby housing prices varies across different levels of social vulnerability. The clustering results of the central trade will group into 4 groups, as shown in this figure on the left side. Group 1 through Group 4 lead to higher vulnerabilities in areas within the groups. And within each of these groups, Group 1 have the highest average housing prices, and Group 3 has the lowest. And then the table on the slide summarizes the analysis results. Each column indicates a different buffer distance for the transition property to the nearest mitigation project. For example, the 0 to 100 meters columns reflect the impact of cell properties located within 100 meters of the mitigation measures. And looking at the buyout programs, we see that neighborhoods with a higher vulnerabilities, which is the Group 4, experienced more significant price declines between 3.6% and 8.5%. However, these effects tend to diminish with distance, suggesting a limited geographic reach. In contrast, elevation projects cause more severe negative spillover effects, with nearby homes value decreasing by 10.7% to 25.3%. This impact is strongest in trades with a high density of elevated homes or higher overall housing prices. However, in both the most vulnerable area, the Group 4, and the least vulnerable area, the Group 1, where fewer elevation projects occurred, the spillover effects are not statistically significant. This suggests that the negative price impact of elevation is more likely driven by the density of elevated homes and the baseline market value rather than social vulnerability alone. And this is all for my presentation. This is about the summary, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. That was a surprising twist at the end there. I think we have to unpack that a little bit. Okay, great. Should we have 20 minutes of discussion? Yeah. Great. Do we have a microphone?
Yes, there's a.
Oh,
there are
here
a
we
few
go.
here.
Great. And Chris, you want to come up? And
So,
you guys want to come sit up here? Here. So we had a question online for you, and maybe we could start with that.
Sure.
And Chris, you could sit here. And
Is this working? Okay. Green roofs, very big topic. Actually, during my research, there was one of the articles that came up, and I do want to quote this. It was called Expanding Green Roofs Towards Location-Specific Tax Incentive. It was released by the NYU Environmental Law in 2018, and it specifically addressed the green roof tax abatement program and why it's not successful in New York City, because I believe only 12 properties, at least by 2017, had used that abatement program. And one of the reasons was the abatement value was just too low. I think at that time, when this first started, a priority tax would get $5.23 compared to the $15 abatement value that is being currently offered. That was definitely a reason. And then the other reason being green roofs are expensive. And there's I think a lot of people are afraid to go through those retrofits. And I understand that. It can be architecturally, it can be challenging architecturally, and not all buildings are built in a way that can retrofit green roofs. But I think the program is hearing, I think, all of these considerations, and they have been modifying a lot of um, their criteria is based on people's feedback. One of them being the green roof depth has decreased, I think, from the previously 6 inches to 4 inches, which a lot of extensive roofs, which are much lower in cost and also smaller in smaller effort compared to an intensive roofs, can support. But that was my question. I don't know if it answered. Or that was my answer. I don't know if it answered.
That's great. I think it did. Yeah, and maybe we can just pick up on this topic of the kind of the social barriers to adaptation. You know, I think Eric's plan for blue zones presents some challenges in terms of like bringing communities on board to accept adaptation challenges. We just heard from Ruili this really surprising thing that elevations might decrease background property values. I really want to unpack that. I'd like to better understand that. We got Liz Greenstein in here. I don't know if that bears out in your experience. No, there's something going on there that we have to figure out. We've got people in the room from the Housing Recovery Office and others that have worked on elevations and that have tried to create value in our neighborhoods from a social point of view, as well as, you know, for low-income homeowners to preserve their property values through adaptation methods. But it is scary, like you said, Shibani, like it can be scary to adopt change. So maybe we could, and it's also scary for the Parks Department to spend so much money on these adaptation projects that, you know, when we have so much uncertainty around sea level rise, we know it's going up, but we don't know the rate. We don't know how long these marshes will be in place. We don't know what you're going to dig up when you're excavating all that work. So maybe we could just go around and talk about managing uncertainty with stakeholders and managing the fear that we feel around adaptation projects. Maybe Eric, we'd start with you, like any strategies for blue zones to bring people together to manage the fear of change?
Well, one of the things that Lucy and I have been working on with the DEP is talking to communities about why these projects are necessary. You know, because they are disruptive. They need to tear up streets, and they, you know, need to put storage containers in parks and so forth. And people don't like that sort of thing. They don't like anything that's going to get in the way of their daily life, understandably. So our strategy has been to actually lean into the historical ecology, and not just what it was like 400 years ago, but actually go to communities and walk them through the map, show them, you know, this is what your community looked like 200 years ago, this is what it was like 150 years ago, this is what it was like 100 years ago. And you can, you know, New York City has a wealth of historical maps, and we've georeferenced many of them. And so you can actually see how individual neighborhoods are developing. Because, you know, many of the decisions that are affecting where water goes today were made by our parents and by our grandparents and by our great-grandparents, right? In the same way that we're making choices for our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids about what kind of adaptation that we do. So I think it helps for me anyway to understand each place in its historical context, and to help understand why these sort of large things are required of us.
Another thing that we did in Corona was we brought our historic maps to the community and we asked people to put stickers on the maps of where they see flooding. And I know that's a common activity, but I think it really helped to put themselves in the current data that we had. So we have like the 311 calls, but there are a ton of points. We have 10 years of data. And it was really great to see for us, and I think for them to hear that we are seeing where they know flooding is, and then we can sort of explain that with the historic ecology and say, well, yeah, you're downhill from this, and there was a stream here. Yeah.
That's awesome. So using history as a tool to have conversations with the community. Chris, you want to respond about uncertainty working with the neighbors of these marsh retreat projects?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're definitely working in natural areas, so there aren't a lot of people nearby. And there are some issues with what we call encroachment, where people are moving on to parkland that are pretty interesting. But it's really about people wanting access to, these natural areas and water. But yeah, I don't know. There aren't that many conflicts with structures or things like that, other than internal things. Thinking about our own infrastructure and parks, roadways, and pathways. And I think people definitely are on board with making sure those pathways are still there in the future with flooding.
Yeah. Cool. Well, yeah, you guys are preserving this incredible natural asset for communities. Paul, you put your hand up. Paul Gallet.
Thank you to all of you for these presentations. They're so valuable. And I'm thinking about the types of flooding slide from Lucy and Eric's presentation. And clearly, most of the blue zone areas, the biggest risk is coastal flooding. But my question is about frequency and impact of risk, which I don't think is necessarily the same sort of proportion. Many of us in the room are working with the Army Corps of Engineers on the harbor and tributaries study and working so painfully slowly to get them to focus on more than just coastal flooding, as Congress has required them to do. So it'd be very valuable to have a good, strong sense as to the relative frequency and impact of these different types of flooding to help make our case that you just have to think about more than coastal flooding.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And then the last round of the New York City panel on climate change was really great and also very lengthy chapter on flooding. It actually highlights 4 kinds of flooding. There's pluvial flooding when it's raining hard. There's fluvial flooding along the streams, along the rivers. There's the coastal flooding, and then there's the groundwater flooding, which Shibani was talking about. So yeah, that's right. That's right. But frequency is important. And hurricanes isn't necessarily the best way to think about it in the New York City region. If you look back over the last, 400 years that we have a little bit of information about this, we get 1 or 2 big hurricanes that strike this region per century, but we get nor'easters almost every year. And so those are also increasing of intensity and increasing these flood events too.
Do you know where we can find that relative frequency data?
Well, actually, in the book that Bill and I edited for Jamaica Bay, there's a table of all the large storm events for Jamaica Bay that we were able to find. It runs to 4 pages long, but it highlights the hurricanes and the major nor'easter storms. Yeah. But Thad, I wanted to make sure that you address how Robert Moses dealt with uncertainty in the past.
I mean, he was deaf, like he was literally deaf toward the end of his life and didn't allow for these feedback loops that we're all building into our processes. And so I think that's the major thing. But I do think like with the blue zones, he was very innovative too in his, singular perspective. And I think there is a power in like public authorities, for instance, to think about ways to bring people together to do large scale change in neighborhoods. And maybe that, we could be informed a little bit by his boldness of assembling different sources and uses. There's a comment on here, by the way, and it relates to this about someone it has a co-op where they just, replaced the roof like recently, and it's going to last for another 20 years. And so where in the process do we of like any asset investment, can we jump in with the resilience measures? And I think that's another big question for the blue zones. Like maybe the blue zones get on to some sort of regulatory map, like in the zoning resolution. And then over time, as people redevelop, there can be incentives for, private landowners to do things. And I think that those are the kinds of tools that we're used to because it sort of feeds into this, like continual feedback mechanism. And a lot of the regulatory reform that we've had, like with ULURP and other things in New York City, a result of Robert Moses trying to do everything at once, So I think we have to do both in some ways, take big, bold moves and also have like these feedback mechanisms that like zoning and other kinds of slower processes allow. That's my thinking now, but I saw a hand up over here, so maybe we could.
I'll get you halfway. Okay. So my question is for Chris. You talked about salt marsh migration, and in Hawaii, our beaches are also dynamic and would migrate, would be resistant to climate, sea level rise, except for they run up against urban development, which blocks their natural migration. So with salt marsh migration, you said you've identified the barriers. Have you been able to remove any of them? Or do you plan to, or try to?
Yeah, that's definitely the next step. I mean, we are doing some work with like the vegetation that I mentioned, Phragmites, which is, I think studies have shown, can impede migration over time. So if you can deal with that and allow native species to move in, that would be ideal. But I mean, historically in the city, we've done a lot of fill removal around our wetlands, which, oddly enough, we're bringing that fill down back to the wetland level. We have more recently in our restoration projects on the edges tried to incorporate a more gradual slope and build everything or restore our, marshes higher or as high as we possibly can to take into account for sea level rise. But yeah, that's definitely a next step, is to look at more of these larger barriers and get some funding to remove them.
More questions from the audience? Anybody want to? Bill.
Sorry, I came in a little bit late in the talks, but I was just wondering, I know Eric and Lucy, your work kind of speaks to this, but I was wondering in your presentation or generally, in terms of the flooding potential in the city, has there been work recently looking at those areas that have been landfilled? And Chris just mentioned that much of the coastal area around the city has been landfilled, right? And so it's in these sites where we're seeing a lot of flooding. But I'm just wondering about what's happening with the flooding in terms of that soil. Is there more? Have we seen more? I see the mic going back. More subsidence or potentially compaction, in some of those sites where there's landfilling. And this is more of a technical kind of hydrologic question, so I apologize rather than ecological.
No, I don't know about the subsidence part of it, but in the larger Wallachia project, we have a historical topography layer that you can compare to the modern topography layer. So you can do a cut and fill diagram. And so we've been talking about a sort of program of research around brownfields in New York City, which would get at the kind of thing that Chris is talking about, trying to actually map in a comprehensive way all the places where fill has happened, and also all the places where cut have happened, right? Because reducing topography also has an effect on where the water would go. And then, as Chris found out, or if you read the New York City soil survey, there are all kinds of anthropogenic, urbanized soils that are full of basically garbage, right? One of Robert Moses's strategy, to bring it back to Thad's presentation, is that he would encourage people to dump, stuff in the salt marshes that he didn't want anymore, right? To get rid of them, but also make them noxious, so that then there would be a public outcry to fill them in, and then he could build his highways or do whatever he wanted to do. And it's a major, major legacy here in New York City, all the toxics. And of course, as from a historic perspective, it's amazing to think that such a narrow period of time really, late 19th century into the mid 20th century caused so much damage that's going to have a legacy for thousands of years in this landscape and for the people that live here. It's really just so very unfair. And to me, it goes back, to these sort of fundamental presumptions about the land that we carry forward from our colonial fathers and continue to enact in our social and economic and environmental policies. Want to add something?
That's down. Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for all of the amazing work that y'all have done. I think I would like to add a question for Shibani. Greatly enjoyed your presentation. Something I'm curious about is if we can also get a discussion about reparations as part of the work that you recommend. I think you did touch upon it a lot, but if you think it would be politically feasible to really frame things in terms of reparations, that these communities were harmed, and that this work to help them, work with them, is more than just being nice; it's necessary.
That's a great question. I don't know if I'm the right person to speak on this, I will say, but I think from like analyzing so many policies and programs, I did see that a lot of current stormwater policies and plans, they don't really talk about, I think, the communities that are disadvantaged in terms of racial demographics, in terms of social demographics and income. And I think one way to connect reparations with this, like you said, would be to start investing in those communities that were previously in the red line C and D lots, which were considered the least undesirable areas to live in, and focusing on those areas. In the case of Southeast Queens, a lot of those C and D red line lots fall under separate sewer systems where we don't really have that many solutions at the moment for separate sewer systems, at least in terms of nature-based solutions. And maybe this could be sort of like a gateway, like we need to address this system that we don't have that many nature-based solutions for. I think I'm repeating my words, I'm sorry. But I think that would be one way of looking into, we have this problem. We know what this community needs, that is better stormwater management, if they're not able to immediately remove themselves from this neighborhood. So how can we achieve that? And I think that would mean investing science and technology into different solutions where water not just go into pipe that gets dumped into the Hudson River, but it gets conveyed, it gets slowed down through different process. Does that mean a system of green roofs for the entire neighborhood where water is slowly conveyed for the entire neighborhood, or does it mean a system of rain gardens or something else? I don't have that answer yet.
Just an added note, one of the problems with Southeast Queens is the groundwater is very high there. And so your standard green infrastructure approaches aren't so great, like a rain garden, because you're just putting water back in the ground and the water is already high. So the solution is trees, actually. I think a big reforestation program in Southeast Queens would, at least over the long term, put more water back into the sky. And if you look at the historical maps, not only was there a lot of tidal marshes, but there were very extensive freshwater marshes all through that area, as we were discussing yesterday.
I think there's a reparative justice aspect to what you proposed too, with the stormwater fund, the stormwater fee being separated out. Large property owners, especially like in a lot of the blue zones. I think we're seeing a lot of new last mile warehouses and logistics centers, other like vast expanses of roof and parking lots that we should really have, these big corporations pay into a large scale stormwater mitigation.
A quick note on that. I know in 2011, the DEP did a study where it was finding parking lot owners that were not doing anything and just keeping their parking lot abandoned. And it found that a lot of those parking lot owners were okay to pay that fee. I would be curious to see how this would translate to large property owners like Walmart, like those big box stores that have more assets and have like a larger area compared to a single parking lot. And would that mean that they will finally do something so that they avoid getting a fee, or would they continue getting a fee? Either way, someone would be getting fined.
I think there's another Robert Moses connection here, which is, where did the power broker's power come from? It came first from because he was building parks, and parks were so wildly popular that he could just overwrite any other politician with his popularity. But the thing that Caro shows in the book is, Robert Moses figured out that it wasn't really just about parks. It was about all the contracts and the jobs and the economics, which I think is a really important point that, we can talk till we're blue in the face about climate change and environmental goods and all these sort of things. But if it isn't tied to the economic system, then we're not in our capitalistic society going to make the changes that are required. And that's why these like stormwater fee proposals are so very important. And there's many other ideas in this mode, including the idea of an ecological property tax in chapter 13 of Terra Nova.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Great book. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're like a minute over time, so we should probably close it. A round of applause for our panel and.
So I'm going to go ahead and get started introducing this session because we have some great presentations, but we have limited time and we want to make sure we have time for everyone. So I just want to double check. Is Carrie Schul, did she sign in via Zoom? Is she online? We might.
Hi, everyone. I'm here.
Oh, great. You just turned on your camera and you're visible now. So that's wonderful. Carrie's going to be presenting first, actually. Did you download her presentation or is she you're going to screen share, I guess. Is that right, Carrie?
Yes, I'll screen share.
Great. Sorry, it's not showing up there. All right, so we're doing.
Can I go ahead and share now?
Yeah. Yep, you can go ahead. But I want to go through first and just talk about, you can go ahead and get your slides up, Carrie, no problem. But I want to just mention on the app, one of the presentations was missing. That's Fabien Cotier, my colleague here. And he'll be presenting as well. So that means we have 4 wonderful presentations. We're going to keep people to 15 minutes, including myself. After Carrie, we'll have Feliz Garipe presenting on asymmetry of climate-induced migration decisions, departure and return. Then we'll have myself and David Rathel, who's online, presenting about international migration from Central America and West Africa. And finally, Fabien Cotier will be talking about climate shocks, displacement, and organized crime in Central America, which is a topic that we're all actually been working with David with as well. So with that, I think I'll just pass things to Carrie so she can get us off started with beyond push factor narratives, development, climate change, and the social production of migration, aspirations, and capabilities in rural Ethiopia. Over to you, Carolyn.
Great. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we see you. And I'll try to keep time. You might hear my voice at a certain point and I'll say, 1 minute or something.
Okay, sounds great. I'm very happy to be here. Very grateful we can join virtually. Wish I could be with you all in person. It's looks like a wonderful conference. I'll jump right in. What I'm going to focus on today is a case study research from a village called Waiso in Ethiopia. And a lot of what I've been thinking about lately is, how can we effectively move beyond push factor narratives? And what I mean by that is how do we move beyond seeing sort of a climate hazard or climate impacts as these push factors that uproot people? What's an alternative sort of theoretical or conceptual approach that would allow us to, as I think Alex put in his session description, better understand the indirect effects of climate impacts on different mobility and immobility outcomes? So why challenge push factor narratives? Why are they inadequate? Well, one important reason is that they kind of perpetuate mobility bias in migration research. So it gives an overemphasis to the drivers of migration and neglects the factors that might resist movement or restrict movement. And when we pay more attention to those factors, we start to see many different ways of staying put. And immobility is one of the puzzles. I think any researcher who's looking at climate migration quickly realizes that often less people are moving than we would expect them to. The framework that you see on the right is the aspiration capability framework, which I found helpful in that it distinguishes between the aspiration to move and the capability to do so. In order to move, you need both of these things, but some people might desire to move and lack the capability and be involuntarily immobile, while others might not have a desire to leave, regardless of whether they would or wouldn't be able to move. So the theoretical approach that I've been playing with for the last few years is really mobility transition theory. And this is an older theory that sort of thinks about the relationship between migration and development, not just economic development, not just human development, but really more and more researchers are talking about social transformation, these sort of big, deep changes to society that occur and that we tend to talk about in terms of development. And the reason I think this is so important is because it's actually in many so-called developing country contexts that we see some of the greatest vulnerability to climate change, but these are also the exact same contexts in which development is reshaping migration systems. And so understanding how climate impacts intersect with these developmental drivers of migration is really important. So the basic insight of mobility transition theory is that economic growth, expanding education, infrastructure, changing culture, ideas about the good life, all of these are reshaping people's aspirations and their capabilities to move. On the right side is a chart from Ethiopia, which is just showing migrant stock data since 1960, and the darker shades show huge international movements under the Marxist Derg regime, when most people were asylum seekers or refugees. But from the 1990s onwards, that picture changed, and we started to see a lot more international migration for other reasons. Ethiopia is a very interesting case for studying the relationship between migration and development. Anyone familiar with the country is likely thinking about the more recent Tigray War from 2020 onwards, and of course, massive displacement that was associated with that conflict. But there are also very deep-seated shifts in how Ethiopians are moving both within the country and internationally. And in one paper with the geographer Asma Malagaspa here, we tried to map how the whole kind of migration system in Ethiopia was changing since 1960. And we noticed three core trends. One is that there's a decline in more traditional mobility systems. So by that, I mean nomadic or semi-nomadic movements, seasonal agricultural movements. There's been an urbanization of internal migration. So Ethiopians have always been very mobile, but historically this has been rural movements. And it was in the 2010s where that changed. And now rural urban migration is the most common internal migration trajectory. And then we've seen a diversification of international migration. And what I want to focus on here, and a big driver of this diversification, is the rise of international labor migration. And a lot of that is directed towards the Middle East. As you can see in the map to the left, there's really three main migration routes of international migrants from Ethiopia southward down through Kenya, Tanzania, onto South Africa, kind of west through Sudan and onto Europe, and then to the Middle East. And this is these are very young migrants. A recent survey, we have very bad migration data, like in many places all over the world. But what data we do have suggests that these international migrants are very young. 78% in a recent survey were between the ages of 15 and 29. And 31% of those were moving to Saudi Arabia alone. So the Middle Eastern migration trajectory is a big one. Now, these migration trajectories are also very gendered. So we have predominantly men moving southwards, and we have a lot of women who are moving to the Middle East to meet the demand for domestic workers in those countries. So the WAISO case study, the reason why I think it's important is it's an interesting case to really think about how we might integrate mobility transition theory with an analysis of climate impacts. And what I'm going to focus on here are the findings around immobility impacts of a severe drought that hit WAISO in 2015, 2016. And I want to show how the different aspiration and capability categories, mobility, involuntary mobility, even voluntary mobility, these that we might benefit a lot from not seeing these as outcomes that resulted from the drought, but as kind of pre-existing outcomes that are related to different developmental drivers, and then understand how a drought reshapes the experiences of those mobility and immobility outcomes. That was not super clear, but in essence, I'll argue that involuntary immobility really deepened through the drought, but that I also saw continued migration, which was not actually in relationship to the drought, but for people who were pursuing education, salaried work, or international labor migration, and were able to draw on their migrant networks to move during the period of the drought. So this is based on household survey data, in-depth interviews, primarily collected between 2016 and 2018. But I also draw on more ethnographic methods and archival research. And really my goal is not to make a claim about all of rural Ethiopia and the drivers of international migration there, but really to contribute to more theoretical generalization to better understand the social world that, in particular, women are choosing to leave when they move as domestic workers. Now, most of the people who are leaving WAISO from the household survey data, most people are moving very short distances from the village to the neighboring towns. You also see some longer distance movements to larger cities in Ethiopia, and a small but significant share who are moving to the Middle East. To put some of the findings from my qualitative research up front, one thing that was very striking, I kind of came in expecting, based on previous research or headlines I'd read about this movement, I was expecting to hear kind of horrific stories of trafficking and exploitation. And I was surprised by how rational women were in making this decision to leave, and often how young they were. But this was really related to changing ideas about what a good life is, and these deep aspirations for change, a discontent with rural futures or early marriage, and a real desire to have an urban future. And so one way of describing this is that aspirations have expanded faster than the capabilities to realize them in Ethiopia. And for women, there's this distinct opportunity to move to the Middle East because there are these brokers and agencies who are facilitating that movement. And just within the period of a decade or two, labor migration has really become an alternative to marriage for a particular subset of young women. I won't dwell on this too much, but I just want to highlight the importance of formal education in this process, not just in reshaping young people's ideas about what they can achieve with their life, but also just structurally, we can see that on the left-hand side, anyone who has secondary education or higher no longer lives in the village, lives in town. With women, it's a similar trend. A lot more women have no education at all and mostly live in rural areas. And in the yellow box there, you can see the women who are moving to the Middle East. So these are not women who have the highest levels of education or come from the most privileged families, but they're also not with the lowest levels of education or the poorest families. So they're sort of in this with middling levels of education and usually middling levels of resources. This was an important part of I apologize for speaking so fast. I realize I've put too much on here for 15 minutes, but This movement was really an important part of the transition to adulthood for young women. And if they couldn't continue with their education, if they failed the exams after grade 8 or grade 10, it was now there were two options. You marry someone or you fly outside to the Arab countries. These are beautiful quotes, but I'll skip them for the sake of time. Now, most of the women who are leaving, why are they leaving? They're leaving to move to town. A good life is only really possible if you actually already have money in your hand. And most households from Waiso, this village, are subsistence farmers, unpredictable annual harvests. So they often don't have money in their hand, nor do they have the promise of a good income from local work if they just decided to move to town. So really, for young women who moved abroad, the goal was to earn enough money to then be able to come back to town, build a house or rent a house, start a small business, and it was really a way of making a rural urban move. Now, domestic workers in Beirut, which was the primary destination from Waiso, earned about $150 per month. They made an investment up front, but then that investment could be paid back from their salaries in the first few months. So this was a very different earning situation from just a rural urban move without the promise of good work. So it's kind of the opposite of the stepwise migration that migration researchers might be more familiar with. This was really this, irony of globalization, that it's easier to move to the Saudi Arabia than it is to actually move, 15 kilometers to the nearest town. Most of the women would use this as an investment in a house for their family and paying for the weddings of their siblings. This was a house in Waiso where the family very proudly put, the woman's name who had built this for them. They'd open their own shops or coffee houses. And also through their movement, signaled changes in sort of lifestyle and fashion. That kind of signaled that they were moving into sort of more modern lives, if you will, compared to other rural women. Now, a lot of women wanted to move but couldn't. I'm happy to answer more questions about that in the Q&A. And the other thing I want to highlight is that many young men didn't have the same opportunity, and involuntary immobility was extremely widespread within Waiso and remained the kind of most common mobility outcome. Many young people and older people wanted to move to town but didn't have the resources to do so. So what happens in this context when a drought strikes? This was a priority zone for the Ethiopian government. It was the worst drought since 1987. And I'm also going to skip this part for the sake of time, as I know I'm approaching my time. But there are some immobility outcomes that I want to highlight. So in the short term, really what drought did is it constrained migration capabilities, particularly for households who are reliant on farming livelihoods. So this meant that for many, migration plans were paused. Maybe I'll be able to migrate after next year's harvest. There was also a heightened reliance on remittances in the village and a deepening of this experience of involuntary immobility, and a risk that some of those who are involuntarily immobile might even become what we call displaced in place. However, migration didn't stop altogether. And I was also struck, just as I was struck by this kind of deepening involuntary immobility and precariousness associated with the drought, I was also struck by some people that just kept moving. And this was often those who had more diversified income sources. They had other businesses they could draw on, networks with salaried work, or migrant ties that were able to facilitate their continued movement. And importantly, their decisions to move were shaped by other goals: education, modern work, urban life, access to capital, not really related to fleeing the climate impacts. So the main point I really want to hit home is that those who left Waiso after the drought were actually the least affected by the drought, and the most direct and kind of devastating effects were on those who did not move. And this does raise a question about, in the long term, recurrent drought could threaten to widen the inequalities between the poorest and the wealthiest households. And much of that inequality stems from access to migration and migrant networks. I have a comment on trapped populations, but I think I'll just jump to the key takeaways. which is that I think we should be cautious about characterizing migration from climate-stressed contexts as climate migration. In Waiso, again, it was those who moved after the drought who were the least affected by it, and that the drought constrained mobility by reducing migration capabilities and deepening involuntary mobility, especially among the poorest. Now, distinguishing between the aspiration and capability to move in research may help us be able to identify who feels involuntarily immobile today, and thus who might be the most vulnerable when a particular climate hazard strikes. At a more theoretical level, climate impacts act through existing migration systems. They don't operate in isolation, and that paying attention to the ways in which different developmental drivers are changing aspirations and capabilities in many low-income countries can help us understand how people are already moving, and then inform our reading of how people will or will not move in response to climate impacts. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to the other presentations. And a last plug for if you'd like a deeper dive into Waiso, I have a book coming out in September digitally. So please take note, and I'll share, I suppose, on LinkedIn once that is out. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Carrie. We've got about 25 people in the room or more, so it's a nice group. Elise, do you want to come on up, and we'll get you set up, screen share. Just so people are aware, we will do some Q&A and discussion, but maybe hold your questions for now, and we'll get everybody lined up.
Shall I go?
Sure.
Thank you, Alex, for organizing this. It's really a great group of people that I admire a lot. I don't think I've met David in person, but hello. And then it's great to be presenting with Fabienne and Carolyn. Long time no see. I really like your theoretical framework, and it's been so generative for climate migration. And I'm sad to say that I'm not going to use it today, but I think about it all the time. So this work is actually joined with Hélène Benveniste, Simone Capisani, Sarah Constantino. So I'm presenting on behalf of all of us. And what we're trying to understand is the Mexico-US migration context, and something Carrie said, that climate migration is going to happen on existing tracks. So this is an idea that we also subscribe to here, and we're trying to understand the sensitivity of this migration flow to climate shocks. Okay, so this research on weather shocks and migration has been expanding in multiple directions. So we know a lot of things already. We know that weather shocks in origin-sending places are related to both internal and international migration. But then, as kind of research accumulates, we also see a lot of mixed results and a lot of variation across settings and population groups. So one of our goals here is to identify the sources of this variation. And what we think we need to know is basically seeing migration more as a process. So a lot of the work that we see is about how when a shock is experienced, whether people depart from a place. But departure is actually only the first step in migration. And when a migrant moves to a place, as Carolyn also talked about, that person has to make the same decision over and over again. Are they going to stay in place? Are they going to move elsewhere? Are they going to come back? So we think that if we see migration and return as connected decisions, we'll be able to better understand the climate migration linkages. So we want to see first how weather shocks matter to both migration and return decisions. And we want to understand if the effects are symmetric, in the sense that if I experience a shock here, what I do is the same as if I were to experience a shock back in Turkey, let's say, where I'm originally from. And then we want to understand if these shocks work differently for different groups in the population. Is there heterogeneity that pooled models will be masking? Okay, the case that we're going to look at is the largest sustained international flow in the world, the movement of people between Mexico and the United States. So the solid line here is showing the number of Mexican-born people in the United States. So you can see that in the 1960s, there were less than 500,000 people. And by 2010, the number had reached over 12 million. So the period that we're studying covers from 1990 to 2018. Again, this is a period of mass mobility where over 6 million people entered the country, many of them multiple times. The data set that we use for migration comes from the Mexican Migration Project. So this is a repeated cross-sectional design that started in 1980s. And each year, researchers go to a select few communities in Mexico, and they canvass the entire community, and they randomly select 200 households. And then for each of these households, everyone living or kind of who's away from that household temporarily, they collected retrospective life history information. So we can basically recreate the experiences of these people going back. And the time period that we're relying on here covers from 1991 to 2018. And we cover about 157 communities in Mexico that are kind of regionally diverse. We have information on characteristics and life choices of people. For about 100,000 individuals in total, about 8,000 have migrated to the US at least once. Because we have this person year information, this gives us about 1 million observations, person year observations to work with that are spread across this time period. Now we're interested in basically gradual changes in weather, like changes in temperature and changes in precipitation. And for that, we obtained the Debnath data. This is gridded data that is collected by a NASA service, Debnath, and it's the finest resolution that we can find. It covers every kilometer square grid in North America, and it records daily precipitation and temperature values. So this data becomes available after 1980 onwards. So we use these data to basically overlay the grids onto our communities, and then we create kind of aggregate measures of precipitation and temperature. For their destinations in the United States, we rely on MSA, Metropolitan Statistical Area level observations. And just for information, the communities in Mexico are smaller than municipalities, which are nested in states. So many of them are quite small. Some of them are from urban places. And the way they isolated the community was basically by neighborhood. Okay, so this is just kind of one picture from our data, just to show kind of the complexity and the patterning of migration flows. So here we see where migrants come from in Mexico, where they cross the border, and where they end up in the United States. So you can see that it's not exactly a straight line. Most people are trying to go to border crossing locations that are easier to cross, or many people from their communities have used that location. And again, for information, about 85% of people in this data are undocumented migrants. So they're really kind of hard to capture with other data sources. So what we're interested in this project is first, whether people migrate, so they leave the community, and then where they end up in the United States, and then whether they return back within the time frame. So we're not really looking at where they're crossed from, but then we can kind of include that later on. Okay, so some patterns. There is basically 5 US states that capture over 70% of the trips in our data. So California is the biggest. About 40% of migrants, over 40% of migrants end up in California. And then Texas and Illinois are the next two. About 10% of migrants each go there. And then New York and Florida are about kind of 4 or 5%. And then the remaining states kind of absorb about 30% of migrants. So the way kind of we look at it is our main outcome of interest is whether someone departs Mexico, and then once they have departed and they're in the US, whether they're going to return back. So to understand this outcome, we fit a linear probability of migration and return. So the model is actually kind of simple. So we look at whether someone is going to take a first US trip in a given year T. And then our main indicators of interest is if their community has experienced any kind of fluctuation in precipitation and temperature in the previous year. We have several controls that we know matter, like age, education, and household wealth and community characteristics. And then importantly here, because migration is such a complex phenomenon, US policy matters, a lot of other things matter. We include regional and temporal fixed effects. So in our models, we have fixed effects for Mexican states and also fixed effects for years. So these basically absorb kind of things we can observe and things we cannot observe. And then this means that the weather impacts are captured if communities in the same state, if there are communities in the same state that experience and do not experience these events. So it's kind of a quite rigid specification. And our sample includes all individuals in these communities starting at age 15 onwards. When it comes to return, our sample gets smaller. So recall we have about 100,000 individuals, 8,000 have migrated. So now our sample has become these 8,000 people. They're in the US, and we're doing the same model. We're looking at, are they going to go back to Mexico? And will this depend on any kind of precipitation and temperature deviation in their current place in the United States? And this time we also include fixed effects for US state indicators because some states are kind of more rigid in how they impose immigration law. Okay, so to understand, to measure these weather deviations, we set aside a decade as our normal period. Basically, we don't want to compare normally hot places to normally cool places. We want to compare each community to its own past and to see if they have experienced something out of their own distribution or kind of at the tail ends of their distribution. So basically, what we do is, if this is our normal period, 1980 to 1990, in every subsequent year, we look at how different the weather condition was compared to that mean in the baseline period divided by the standard deviation. And then we create these indicators. Very wet means the community received more than 2 standard deviations higher rain than its average in its baseline. Wet means it's between 1 and 2 standard deviations, and normal is between -1 and 1. And we do this for both temperature and weather. Okay, so let's kind of look at the main effects first. So here I'm showing you what we observe when we look at the outcome of taking a first trip. We see that when it's very dry, these are kind of drought conditions, there is more migration. So the orange means kind of positive here. But then when it's hot, we see kind of a declined migration, a negative correlation there. When we look at return, the same condition drought now has a negative effect. So in the US, if people experience drought here, they are delaying their return back home. Now, this is a very typical example of like, here is the same shock and people are responding differently, and now we need to make sense of it. So our main goal here is that, is there a better way of identifying the heterogeneity here? And we think this heterogeneity in part lies with kind of population level heterogeneity. Not everyone in the population will respond in the same way. And we want to be able to kind of discover the sources of that. To do that, remember we have indicators like age, sex, education, household wealth, community characteristics. We try all possible interactions between weather and other indicators. So when you kind of fit models like that, you always run the risk of identifying some idiosyncrasy in your data that is not really kind of the signal, it is the noise, because you're overfitting the data when your model gets too complicated. So we want to prevent that. To do that, we actually use cross-validation, and we do some kind of out-of-sample testing to identify the most predictive interactions there. So the way it works is we use a 10-fold cross-validation. So basically, we divide our data into 10 parts. We set aside 1 part for evaluation, performance evaluation, and on the remaining 9 folds, we fit 1 set of models with kind of given set of interactions. And then we look at the predictive performance of that model on kind of the out-of-sample 10th fold. So you do this multiple times. You cycle through the data, picking a different splitting of the data each time, and then you average over. So this way, you kind of minimize the risk of overfitting the data, and you're identifying the signals better. Okay, so these are some results from there. So just for reference, on the y-axis, we see the out-of-sample R-squared of a given model. And then on the x-axis are kind of a selection of models that we've tried, a subset of the many more there. So if you look at the first kind of thing on the x-axis, when we just include Mexican weather indicators, our out-of-sample performance is about 8.5% or 8.43%. Now, what happens when we introduce these interactions? Some of these interactions perform significantly better than this main effect model. And 3 stand out here. One is age interactions. This means that people of different age groups are responding differently to weather shocks in Mexico. The next one is education. And the final one is US, when we include main effects for US states, like the top 5 US states that receive migrants. So all of these things matter. Now that we've obtained this information with this cross-validation, we can go and fit a simpler model and then just consider the things that we know matter, not all possible interactions. So when we do that, we find actually quite different effects for age groups as expected. We see that when it's very dry in Mexico, it's actually the youngest who are mobilized. When we look at the older groups, they are less likely to move. So basically, the small positive effect that we find in the main model is an averaging out of these things. When we look at very hot weather, again, it's like these opposing effects. Now the younger people are less likely to move, and then older people are more likely to do so. And if you remember in the main effects model, this was an actually average negative effect. So basically, by looking at this heterogeneity, I think we can better understand some of the mechanisms that are producing it. Education, similar effects to age. Dry weather increases the migration of least educated people, again, youngest and least educated, and then hot weather is actually decreasing the migration of people with that kind of education. So when we look at extreme weather in top US destinations, surprisingly, we find that it has a positive effect on moving. So this is telling us that as people are escaping these extreme conditions, they end up in places that also experience extreme conditions. Now, what about return? When we do the same thing, like trying different interactions, the results actually are quite different. We don't see an age gradient. We don't see an education gradient. The gradients that we see are by occupation, what kind of occupations migrants are working in the US, and the time that they have already been. So people respond differently depending on these kind of characteristics. And when we kind of dig deeper, we see that when it's very dry here, agricultural workers delay their return. When it's very hot, manufacturing workers, this includes mostly construction workers, delay their return. The mechanism we have in mind here is basically not being able to reach your target earnings. If you're unable to work because of drought or extreme heat, then that delays your return. But then it's kind of different from what we found out in the migration case. So basically, one thing that we want to take away is the asymmetry between the impact of weather depending on where you are. So the same thing that encourages you to move in Mexico is actually discouraging you to move when you're in the US. So the effects are not symmetric. And then the weather impacts vary across groups. And again, here, to identify this variation, we use a data-driven approach. So we did kind of cross-validations, and we try to use out-of-sample performance as a metric to pick these things. And some of the results are actually meaningful, especially when it comes to return, and it varies by occupation, makes a lot of sense to us. When it comes to departure and variation by age and education, again, we're thinking about these things and trying to understand the mechanisms. We're also considering more complex interactions. In other words, does it matter whether you're in rural or urban places, and so on and so forth? And yeah, I'll stop here. So thank you very much.
Maybe since the next two papers are part of the same project, we will stop here for a moment and just entertain any questions that people may have for the presenters who just presented. If there are any in the room or online, I can't read the Q&A down here. Let's see if there's, can't see the presentation. Okay, hopefully that's corrected now. Any questions for the first two presenters? Otherwise, I think we'll go ahead, but we'll have time to have hopefully some discussion after my presentation. So if you want to bring up.
Hello, everybody. May I have a question, please? Hello, can I have a question?
Can you hear me? Yes, you may.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. I have a technical question. So we didn't have opportunity to see the presentation of Phyllis, so it was not shared within the online. Yeah. Hello, everybody. Robert Stojanov, Mendel University, Czech Republic. So it was so interesting, but we didn't. Now we can see that.
Sorry.
Yeah, so we're working on that. Sorry, Robert. And I
No
apologize.
problem, no problem. Yeah. We can speak with Phyllis an online way. Thank you so much.
My presentation. Does this have you can maybe go ahead with Fabian's and I'll put mine on the flash drive. Does this have an ability to transfer to a flash drive?
So you can also.
It's on it. I did load it this morning, so what happened, but Fabian, why don't you come on up and we'll get mine ready. Sharing, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thaddeus. I'm an associate research scientist at CIVIN, where my research looked at the cause of migration, especially climate change, but also the consequence for political violence. I'll be presenting today a paper that is ongoing. We are about to finish. It's due end of next week for a special issue in PNAS, so we're a little bit under pressure. But you'll have the results in primer. And this paper is titled Immobility in the Face of Crisis, Violence and Organized Crime Decrease Climate-Induced Migration from Central America. And I should say, actually, we look specifically at Honduras and Guatemala. That is a joint work with a number of co-authors, primarily Alexei, of course, Jennifer Devine, David Wildhall from Oregon State, who is present online, as well as numerous other colleagues, Alice Aranello Thompson, Rebecca Justin here also in the room, Lea Manak, Nick Maglioka, Jennifer Nakamura, Eric Nielsen, and so. It's part of this Minerva Research Initiative project that looks at the driver of migration in Central America and West Africa. Alex will let you know more about this project, which unfortunately was canceled as many others. We had multiple components, and I will be talking about specifically that component, looking at the interplay between violence, narco-trafficking organization, and migration. So, a little bit about the motivation. So, there has been, obviously, as you all be aware here, there's been a rising number of irregular migrants upon the U.S. southwestern border since the early 2000s and originating from Central America. In a new development, a very marked increase, and I'll show you some numbers afterwards. And not only this, we have a changing composition of those flows. And so increasingly, we have unaccompanied minors that are part of these flows. That raises a question about driving a little bit this change in compositions and the presence of those young unaccompanied minors. Not only this, and I think that's very important in that context, we have a context that is marked by several climate impacts, either drought, hot weather, but also extreme events, hurricanes, floodings, but also, and that's been a little bit, I would argue, left aside in most of the literature on climate migration, significant violence, very high level of homicides, and sustained presence of organized crime organization in these two countries. And most of the literature in this field has been generally looking at the direct impact of climate and migration. And when looking at heterogeneities, mostly looking at profiles of those migrants. But the context in which migration happens and violence in political orders really matter too. And I think it's important to also look at this context and trying to look at the interplay between these factors. And just to anticipate a little bit, so you'll see about what we are going to. So our main finding is basically that the climate drivers themselves have marginal impact on migrations. If anything, it seems that there's significant heterogeneity between Honduras and Guatemala in the migration response to those climate impact, and that violence and narco-trafficking activities, and that I think is a key aspect, have actually a suppressing effect on migration. So I'm not talking here about the direct effect of violence, right? People flee violence. That's a well-established factors, and not telling you, teaching you anything here, but that within a context where you have a significant amount of violence, those climate effects on migration are being suppressed further. So the research question we have is to what extent does the presence of organized crime and violence amplify or suppress the link between climate viability and out-migration in Central America? And so to do so, we used data that's been kindly shared with us by David LeBlanc from a FOI request he had submitted on apprehension of migrants at the U.S. southwestern borders in 2009. And the data itself actually covered the entire domain of apprehensions. We only here look at Guatemala and Honduras because these are the countries for which we have homicide, but most importantly, data on organized crime activities at the very fine grade level. And so we actually conduct analysis at the municipal level, which is admin 2, so it's a bit lower level of aggregation, the data that Philip just talked about earlier. And yeah, we also use econometric models. So what are we talking about? And so here, I'll show you basically like a set of figures. So on the panel A on the top left, you see very well these trends at the monthly level since 2010, when we started to have the data available on border apprehensions. In green, it's for Guatemala, and orange for Honduras. And you see that's very marked increase. This is a log scale on the y-axis. So small change, actually large magnitude in changes. And from about 2010 to the peak in 2019, we have a 20-fold increase in the monthly rate of migration. That's a huge increase. Part of it is we can see a bit the effect of policy change. For instance, the election of Trump in his first administration in 2017 led to a marked drop. The same with the women in Mexico policy with a lag. The other very interesting dynamics there is what you see in panel B is this change in the ratio of unaccompanied minor versus total flow. And you see here, beginning in mid-2012, there's a marked increase in the share of unaccompanied minor from about 10%, and then just in a matter of a year jump to about 30%. And when you multiply this by this massive increase, the numbers are really large, what we're talking about. The gray line, just for you, those of you interested actually in Mexico as a waypoint comparison, just to like really highlight how these countries really are contrasting with what we see in the border region. I would say that you'll see the same picture if you have El Salvador. We don't show it here because we don't have data on narco trafficking organization for this country, but it's the same dynamic. On the panel C on the top right, you see here the homicide rates for these countries. On the left, this is the bar chart you see. I'll talk about the segment line afterwards. So, and I mean, both countries have very high level of homicide violence, topping about 0.4 for Guatemala per 1,000 inhabitants. It's about 100 times more than New York City, and double that for Honduras. The trend, though, it's interesting. The trend is actually decreasing over the period. It peaks in Honduras in 2013, but then it decreases, a steady decrease in violence. But another thing why things get really interesting is that the decrease in violence doesn't necessarily correlate with narco trafficking organizations. What you see on the segment plot at the very top of panel C is that the share of municipio that record high level of drug trafficking and other organized crime organization presence. So we have a pedigree score of 0 to 4, 4 being high certainty, 0 being low certainty, and number actually let's fluctuate across the period, but there's no marked decrease, and that shows something that violence, although it's a byproduct of byproduct activity of those organizations, violence itself has not a clear linkage with the presence and activities of those groups. These groups are involved in drug trafficking, human trafficking. They use a lot of coercions, but high level of violence might be more indicative of the war on drugs, so war with the local authorities, but also violence between organized crime groups and so on. And on the bottom, on the panel D at the bottom right, there you see the trends in with the bar chart with the precipitation and the trends with for the top of the segment chart. We see that decline in precipitation in both countries over the period with compared to fluctuating cloud. So that's a bit about for the context. But I think it underscores why we should be taking this issue around violence and narco trafficking organization seriously in studying those effects of climate on migration in these countries. And so what we did, we have this database of about 6.2 million records, of which going back from FY 2010, so it started in October 2009, and all the way to 2022. It's all Title 8 apprehension. So after 2020, it gets really messy, and we should not use it because of the pandemic and Title 42. But it provides information on date of apprehension. So it's daily, actually, the age, the citizenship, self-reported, of course, and the municipality, state, and country of birth. And as well as information about whether someone is an accompanied minor, part of a family unit after 2012, or a single adult. What we did was to geocode this data for Central America specifically. So we leave the rest outside, and that requires to make the assumption that, of course, if we use this as a proxy for migration, that the place of origin was the place of departure. I think it's a bit of a heroic assumption, but there are reasons to believe that at best it's probably quasi-random. And what we have from some data from census is that by and large, people, especially in rural municipalities, stay within this municipality, so that we think some people certainly might have moved between the place of birth and the time of departure, but we think probably a relatively large share actually left from the place of birth. And so we were able to geocode 40,000 unique geolocations because, of course, many migrants come from the same place, so we have much less unique place of origin than migrants, and which account about 71% of the data set that is geocoded at the municipal level. And if you look at admin 1, so the department is about 90%. In fact, it's actually even higher because that includes also the number for 2022, where there's a huge drop in the accuracy of in the comprehensiveness of the data. So we're looking more at 80% actually. And yeah, we have a geocoder. I won't go too much in detail for the sake of time here, but we try complex algorithm that first try to find this place of birth, state of birth, and then if we don't find it, then try to use a county query instead, using the city as a county, identify an OpenStreetMap, and then trying to invert like sounds that are confusing between English and Spanish, etc. Right, and so that's a map just to show you. This is summing across all 10 years of data we have for our analysis up to 2019. That shows you the distribution of the place of origin of migrant. Again, we assume that the place of birth is the place of departure. We see some interesting patterns, of course. This is on a log scale. So again, small changes in color means small large differences. We see very well major urban areas on this map. So like Tegucigalpa, San Pedro Sula, Huehuetenango, and Guatemala City are a clear hotspot, but we see also some interesting patterns, right? So more, for instance, Honduras, more migration along the Caribbean coast, less on the south eastern side of the country, etc. So I won't go again for the sake of time too much in detail, but that's just to show you a little bit how rich is this data in terms of like identifying the place of origin. And so our research design used this again, the municipal /year setup. It's about, we have 10 years of data in about 650 municipalities between both countries. The dependent variable is the log number of apprehension in a year. So we actually aggregate the data to the year level, annual level. We use other dependent variable like the migration rates and the change in migration. Doesn't seems to matter that much, I should say. But we also try different model. The predictor, so for climate variability, our main predictor is Terra climate, but we also use the GLOW-H2 and the CRU data set. We looked primarily at positive temperature deviation and negative precipitation deviation. So again, as a proxy for drought in that case, as well as using the water stress index with the Terra climate data. We have models that have also negative temperature deviations and from the mean of each panel, so each municipalities, and positive precipitation deviation. But for the main analysis that we present here, just for the sake of interpretation, we keep this a bit simpler. And we use homicide violence. These are data from National Police Organization that measure the rate of homicide per 1,000 inhabitants in each municipality. And we have this narco trafficking pedigree score that varies between 0 and 4, and 4 being high degree of presence of narco trafficking organization. that Nick Magliocca and Jennifer Devine and Beth Tellman have assembled for those 2 countries. And this pedigree data is based on information about drug seizure, evidence of laundering of money, for instance, using cattle ranching, like landing strip in the middle of jungle. So it's a fairly based on fairly broad data, but it's kind of different, distinct here from violence. And so again, as Feliz, we use panel fixed effects. We have panel and your fixed effect with error clustered. It's actually by county, but municipality in that sense. Of course, not country. And yeah, we have model for the joint sample. So the 2 countries we model with each country separately. It turns out it matters a lot. And yeah, I'm gonna present some of the results. So the first thing I'd like to show you is a cross-validation results. So that's a very much similar panel that Feliz presented earlier. So we also use tenfold cross. What we wanted to do here is basically assess to what degree different climate data set help explain better migration versus a null model that just have the fixed effect, but not any variable. And so our setup is a bit different in the sense that we look not at the R square, but the root mean square error, which is kind of similar, equivalent in the same way. But in that case, like negative numbers means a better score. And we show the mean value with the dots, and the whisker show the 80% confidence interval of 200 replications. And so I think the first element that comes out of the picture is that, yeah, it seems that having those climate variable helps, but it really helps very marginally. The gain is very small. And there's kind of uncertainty as to whether they really help. And so I think that's a warning for, like, I think we need to be a bit cautious about those narrative around climate change driving migration out of Central America. Those variables really explain little in of themselves. And what we end up using is mostly the Sierra data. The reason is that it performs actually slightly better on average. And we have data that from analysis that Rebecca did for us that shows that the Terra climate data correlates, especially for temperature, better over Guatemala, for which we had a network of 150 gauges to correlate with that. So we end up using this data. But we also have the result, at least for violence and narco trafficking, are kind of similar with the other data set. Let's say. So these are our main results. We're looking just at the joint sample. So look, starting with the first column, that just have the climate variable. We find generally that temperature increase actually decrease migration in both countries. And that we do find some evidence for the same thing with the water stress index, the drought. So the drought actually decreased migration, but it's just ever so slightly significant. Precipitation is not. Now, what's more interesting, I would say, is when we move to this letting those variables interact with violence first in this middle column, is that violence has actually a suppressing effect on migration. So wherever you have more violence in a given municipality, the decrease in migration that is due to this rise in temperature is actually even larger than what it would be. That's very important. That's different from the direct effect of violence. People, of course, violence create migrants. In that case, I think our coefficient, direct effect, the coefficient for direct effects varies between, is always positive, but not always statistically significant just because of the trends in the data. But that's just different. Here, it's just looking at the municipality of higher level of violence. What is compared to municipality with lower level of violence? How does migration response to climate shock vary? And we find a suppressing effect for temperature. And similarly, for narco trafficking activities, we find where there's more narco presence, there's a higher suppressing effect due to temperature on migration. And the same in that case also for the drought indicator. And I think it's a little bit unexpected because those two variables, violence and narco activities, are actually very weakly correlated. The correlation value is 0.17, so 1.7, it's very small. So they really map onto different dynamics in that sense. And so what we did then was to run the same regression, but this time country by country. And there, I think if you look at the left column, actually the result vary a lot. There's significant heterogeneity. So in Guatemala, we find that higher temperature increased migration. And Honduras, it's the same as the result I showed you. So higher temperature means decreased migration. But the suppressing effect I was telling you about earlier of violence and narco activities on migration is mostly driven and observed in Guatemala. In Honduras, we actually don't find any evidence of suppressing effect. And I think it's a bit unclear what's driving that very marked contrast between those two countries. One element is that Honduras had much higher level of violence over a much longer period, and that could have forced people that might have considered leaving already leave in some sense, so that kind of suppressed this effect. It's also true that the level of wealth in Honduras is also much lower, the GDP per capita than Guatemala, and that could be also an element here. And the last thing is, of course, some measure of exposure. So average elevation in Guatemala is actually higher than in Honduras, and that might be also different exposure and different type of crops in both countries that might react differently to this driver. So it was a bit unexpected. That's what are the results. But these results we have for Guatemala about the suppressing effect of violence and narco activities on the relation between comparative and drought and migration is very robust. It actually, we run a whole different set of robustness model, and we always see this. So it's and also with other climate data sets. So what can we say about those results? And I won't go over this table, just also for the sake of time. I want to reflect a little bit about this suppressing effect due to violence and narco activity. So how can we think about those effects? So I think what we think in the case of violence is actually an immobilization effect. So wherever you have higher violence, these violence are likely to negatively affect the local economy, which means probably households have less resources to support the cost of migration, and therefore when a shock, such as again a climate shock happens, it's even harder to find the resources to migrate. And also higher level of violence could make it much more dangerous to travel along migration routes. That could be one such explanation. For narco activities, it's a bit harder to say just because the indicator is broader, but we think it's probably more of a mooring mechanism rather than an immobilization mechanism. And drug trafficking organization, for their activities, either investing the profit of drugs in terms of cattle ranching, or like just the fact that the flow of drugs, it can lead to local economic boom would be an exaggeration, but local economic development, and that might make household more resilient to those climate shock in that sense. Yeah. And so I will conclude on this. So again, just to summarize, so climate variables generally have low predictive power in Central America. And we have very significant heterogeneous migration response to climate shock across the country. And I think if you have any thoughts on this, I'll be welcoming, because it's been really a puzzle for us. We have tried to run regression across multiple age categories. We find the same results in our case. So maybe it's also bias in the data we're using, but it's very puzzling. And we find the suppressing effect of violence and organized crime, I think. And I didn't quite show you the result here, but if you run the same regression for anarcho minors, you do find this basically the same result, except that here violence seems to be more important contributor to suppression and narco trafficking activities. And I leave it there. Thank you.
While I get set up, maybe there's time for one question for Fabian, if anyone has a question for him. Can I do this? Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
I think that this research really is an interesting, could be really interesting in some of the conversations happening around climate security, and particularly the more militarized responses to this maybe less nuanced analysis that climate, and especially in fragile or conflict affected settings, can drive more instability or more migration or other sort of, escalated conflict response. And I'm just curious how you understand the role of this research in that conversation and if you have any analysis on that.
Maybe if you can quickly repeat because people are online.
Yeah, that's a good thing. So I'll be sure whether I understood your question or not. I think the question is a little bit to what extent our research might be influencing also the response of states with regard to migration, like especially the security and border enforcement response. And we actually had discussion on this. Lewis, it was, but it's all, of course we don't like. So we find the suppressing effect of violence on the response between climate change and migration. And one of our concerns is that people misread this and then make the connection actually violence is decreasing in migration, and therefore anyone who is fleeing Honduras and Guatemala is claimed to being fleeing violence actually lying, and that's certainly not what we want to communicate. And if anything, this coefficient for violence direct effect is positive. It's not always significant, and I think that the trend in decreasing violence makes it really hard to find a direct positive relation. Also because migration is cumulative, so once you have initial shock and a lot of people flee violence, then it leads to permanently higher level of migrations. But that's, I think, the framing is very important, and I think, yeah, thank you for bringing that aspect.
Great. So I think we'll go ahead. We zoomed way in on one of our research products, and now we're going to zoom out a little bit. So just hit that back. Thanks. Hopefully people can hear me online. Just flag there's a problem, you can unmute and say something. So this is collaborative. Fabian was part of this as well. David Rathel, who's online, and Susanna Adamo, who recently left Season, close colleague, was my closest collaborator on this work. On this specific paper, the larger project was part of this Minerva, which, as Fabian mentioned, our funds were cut off. I don't know why this isn't projecting the full screen, so it won't be a problem. It seems to be cutting the last funding. That's okay. Well, let's see if it ends up being an issue. Broadly speaking, the reason Minerva was interested in this is that, clearly there's an interest in why people are leaving the region. And from a security perspective, how can we address this particular combination of factors in the region? And so we look at things like security, safety, stability, and border security as related. What we're going to talk about a bit here is more about the survey data that we have from the regions. But the whole framing of this work was to look at two regions in parallel, try to do the exact same work. We were about to go to the field, and that was actually when our funding was cut off. But this gives you a map. This was work that Brian Kahn, who's one of David Rathel's colleagues, did. Just map out where migration is occurring, where tweets of people who left the region, geolocated tweets. These are people who were tweeting in the region and then are now tweeting somewhere else. These are obviously primarily not demographically representative, but it gives you a general idea of where people may have moved from. This is actually beginning to be a problem, so I don't know what to do. You're presenting it from Google Chrome, so can you download it? Maybe we'll just leave it in this window, see if that works. I can make this bigger.
It's in the browser, right, Alex?
It's in the browser, and I don't know why it's in the browser. Is there a way to download it?
That's the download thing there. But from the top, but from the right.
Is that in PowerPoint?
In the black ribbon, the third from the right is the download button.
In some other browser now. Just scroll down. Okay, so we'll get through this technological challenge. So basically, we wanted to find out what migrant motivations were, and we had two strategies. One was to review all the survey data evidence that we had from the two regions, and then to go to the field. And as I said, just as we were about to go to the field, our funding was cut. Or that actually the whole program was cut. So just to be in truth, Minerva was cut as a program, which is a shame. So we summarize in this paper the literature review on what surveys show about migration motivations. First, I want to just talk a little bit about what's going on climatically in both regions. So temperatures are rising throughout in both regions, but in Central America, it's the midsummer drought that's expanding. You also have these, horrific hurricane impacts, Ida and Iota, and I think it was 2021 or so that just had massive impacts. And then you have these impacts on staple crops and also on some commercial crops such as coffee. In West Africa, the pattern is rainfall recovery in most of the regions since the 1980s. Temperatures are rising up, and you'll see in the map in a moment in the western and southern parts, and crop yields have generally increased. So this is a little contrary to some of the narratives we hear about, declining crop yields. Actually, in this region, crop production has increased, but so has population. And so you'd have to look at the population, the kind of per capita yields as well. So this gives you an idea. In the lower left, you can see some work that Richard Seeger and Jenny Nakamura did on like the different drought patterns. And so this is precipitation only, not drought, but basically you can see how precipitation has declined precipitously during the midsummer drought, which is in July. In West Africa, what you see is a pattern where along the coast, there's a general drying during the wet season, but the monsoon season in much of West Africa has seen increases in rainfall, especially in the Sahel since the 1980s, but temperatures have risen as well, so that could have implications for potential evapotranspiration. Generally speaking, what we see in the literature, and many of you are familiar with this paper by Roman Hoffman from Science Magazine, where you have very conflicting evidence on the degree to which various climate variables actually impact international migration, just looking at international migration. So it's an important research area to kind of establish whether climate is actually affecting international migration. So what does the survey research show? First, let's just peel back the onion a little bit and talk about some of the language. We use the term drivers, but drivers actually can mean different things. And so Van Heer has a very helpful kind of disambiguation, I guess you could call it, where you talk about predisposing drivers, things that might create a context in which migration is more likely, proximate drivers, which are the kind of the more direct things like employment or poverty rates that might affect a person, precipitating drivers, which might be that little thing that flicks someone off, like it's a major hurricane, a major disaster, or that maybe there's some other military conflict or something, narco activity, who knows? And those things just flick people off and kind of get them, they're already on the cliff and as it were, sitting in a precarity, and then they get flicked off that cliff and they make that decision to go. So it sort of triggers their decision. And then finally, you might have these mediating drivers. I also like, and this is all supposed to be lovely animation, but what you see on the right-hand side is some more recent work by Fresnova Flood, which looks at kind of the more interior experience of migrants. What are they actually experiencing? What is their emotional state? What are their kind of family relations? How are they feeling about the decision to migrate? Are they excited? Are they more fearful and apprehensive? Are they being forced in some way by family members, or is the culture in some way or another kind of forcing them into a position where migration seems like one of the only options to realize their aspirations? So we want to kind of, both in a paper that we're preparing, critique what surveys actually talk about when they talk about drivers and root causes and these sorts of things. We want to actually try as much as possible to bring out some of the emotional, psychological, and religious and cultural factors that may be more difficult to capture than in the surveys. You have examples of work by Richard Black in West Africa and an Italian colleague through the FUME project, where they talk about the contingency, the state in which African youth kind of live in a state of constant contingency. If things don't work out here, I'll go somewhere else. If it doesn't work out there, I'll go somewhere else yet again. And if a pirogue shows up and someone calls me from the city and in Dakar and says, hey, there's a pirogue heading up to the Canaries, I'll go on that pirogue because it's an opportunity that I might not get, 6 months from now or whenever. So these are things that are kind of difficult to ascertain through surveys. Again, we miss out on root causes. A lot of the root causes issues are things like the political economy or corruption or repression. Violent conflict may be more obvious in some cases, but in many cases, migrants might take these as a given. They might cite them or they might miss them in some ways. Poverty is an underlying driver, but you don't really ask, migrants aren't asked, what's the power relations? What are your capabilities? The Sen approach, that kind of thing. They're not really aware often of those things, so they may not be able to fully articulate what's going on kind of at the local level that might cause people to have a strong motivation to migrate out of a location. And then we did these, we collected as much survey evidence as we could find. We found 12 surveys in Central America and only 4 surveys in West Africa that had multiple waves or runs. So some of these are continuous, like the 4MI surveys, and others are more one time only. And we basically recategorized the survey results into these 11 categories. And I'll just run through some of the results here. And I'm going to skip this one because that one was, I skipped the slide in the PowerPoint as well. But this here shows you kind of the main reasons that people cite in Central America grouped across surveys. And what Susanna has done here helpfully is actually count the number of observations in thousands on the y-axis on the right-hand side. So you can see which of these questions are actually more frequently responded to by respondents. And obviously economic reasons are a major driver, but what you find in Central America is that corruption and violence and conflict and insecurity are all like up there around 20% of respondents. There's a pretty high standard deviation, but it is somewhat in contrast to what you see in West Africa. And environmental stressors are at around 10% of respondents, so it's a relatively low fraction. For West Africa, you're missing the yellow bar, which tells you the number of actual migrants who said that response. But what you see is basically, again, economic factors are important, but they're much lower than in Central America. Only 55% of respondents in West Africa said that economics is the main reason, or jobs or pay. Family and societal reasons are much more important. So the sending money home is a really important factor. Family and personal reasons, that family and household context is really vital in parts of West Africa. And then you have a very high also response on violence and conflict. But environmental factors end up only being about 3%. It does matter where you interview migrants. So one of the things I didn't mention was some of these surveys are carried out at the border, like in the US. Some of them are carried out in the US or in Europe, so at the destination area, and then others are carried out at the origin area. And in our paper, we're going to be much more precise about where the surveys are carried out. But what you get out of this is that basically, for the most part, for good reason, people at destination say violence, conflict, and human rights abuses and other things are the main reason they left, because they want to stay on message. If you deviate from that message and say economics or jobs was the main reason I left, you may jeopardize your chance at an asylum claim. So I think that's a very obvious reason why that's different. Issues around violence and insecurity, conflict, and rights and freedom are cited twice as frequently by Central Americans as they are for West Africans. But these traditional factors such as family and personal reasons in West Africa are very common as opposed to Central America. This is a nice little framework that David, our sort of approach to like mapping change, and I'm only going to focus on 2, but basically if you look at the origin areas, it's all in purple. We're looking at aspirations and capabilities. So the purple areas are in the 1992 state, and now we're looking at 2021, roughly 30 years later. And what are some of the things that have changed? Well, if you look at just climate change, you see number 4, the aspiration is likely to have increased, but the capability is likely to have decreased. This is hypothesized. This is not necessarily what our empirical evidence shows, but it's hypothesized. But if you look at something like social media and tools that allow people to communicate across borders, that's was both low, incited relatively low aspirations because people weren't getting tweets and messages and TikTok videos from the United States or Europe, but they also weren't being assisted along their migratory route by these social media tools and WhatsApp and things like that to actually find their way. So these tools have basically increased both the capability and the aspiration to migrate. Why are environmental stressors less reported? We have a number of hypotheses. One is that these are often distal drivers. So a drought impacts your crop yield, that impacts your livelihood, it impacts your poverty level, but you don't always trace things all the way back to that. The other is that things like corruption and governance may be affecting things like response. You don't have a FEMA, you don't have a disaster management agency in many Central American countries. So that natural disaster occurs, and you attribute the fact that you had to leave because there was no nobody to actually bail you out. There's no social safety net, essentially. Extreme events could trigger more migration than an underlying cause or reason for migrating, so it's more of a trigger. These are more given things that people don't really think about necessarily. Or it's simply that in the panoply of factors, environmental factors are generally relatively limited, and that's the evidence that Fabian just presented. These are some earlier Bayesian hierarchical models that Fabian ran without going down to the municipal level, but just by country. What we see in Central America is that, apprehensions at the southern border are related to the people coming from Central America. It's related to low levels of democracy and higher levels of violence and homicide rates. But in West Africa, it's more related, again, to lower levels of democracy and actually low levels of homicide or violence. I think that was more like conflict fatalities, right? Not homicides. But the diaspora effects are off the chart. So if you have family in Europe, that's a huge factor. So some conclusions, these are tentative, and I hope I'm not going over time. I apologize, but the survey research can provide important insights, but the choice sets are fundamentally limited. So we know about this. It's not something that we are coming up with new, but it's important to kind of delve into this. One way of maybe changing some of those questions might be more about what would make life better at home. If you could stay, would you stay? What would be the things that would need to change at home in order for you to stay? Did you manage to actually achieve aspirations that you had when you left, if you're talking to someone at destination? And these were actually questions that we plan to ask in a larger scale online survey, but again, for lack of funding, we're unable to go forward. And then lastly, I think really critically is, what does this all tell us about what we can do to actually affect migration? And is there something that we can pull from these results? If yes, superficially, yes, I would say that yes, if you improve the local economy, you could potentially have the migration levels. So people had more jobs and economic opportunities. But then these larger structural factors are really important to address: governance failures and political economy. And there's just a sense in West Africa, for instance, of, I think, endemic hopelessness about the potential. This is something Carrie touched on, is what is the potential for me to realize my life dreams by sitting in a village somewhere that's isolated, maybe doesn't have good internet, and where the sense of opportunity is missing. These are some macro things that you can pull out through interviews, and I'm not going to go into these here because I'd really like to open this up for a larger conversation. But things like narco and gang violence, I think, are important. They really are drivers. But even though our empirical data suggests maybe they suppress migration, there are things that many migrants have spoken about when they come across the border. Family reasons are also important, and then things like imaginaries in West Africa. This is a term that isn't used a lot in the US, but young people are imagining a brighter future. They're kind of thinking about this great utopian future. And if you've seen the movie Il Capitano or something like that, young guys in Dakar, and they're just imagining this great life they're going to have as rock stars in Europe. And I mean, this seems a little far-fetched, but I think there's that element of like, I could win the lottery and I could really strike it big. And I think we can't discount that as a potential motivator, especially for younger migrants. And these are some verbatims I'll just leave up on the screen of interviews with migrants, and I'll leave them there so that we can actually get into a little discussion. And apologies for some of the technical issues we had, but we'll open it up if there's any questions or comments. I think, fundamental question, maybe I'll ask Carrie and you, Felice, if there are ways in which you feel that your findings could feed into policy or might actually make a difference for people. And it's probably not just about like, can we keep people in place, but actually like what could make it, how could people realize migration journeys that are also transformative in some way? And so maybe you could speak to that. And Carrie, I know you thought a lot about these issues. I do have a hand up in the room, but maybe we'll just start there and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, Alex. And these presentations are so stimulating. So thank you to all the presenters as well. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this concept of the capability to stay. We talk a lot about the aspiration and capability to migrate, but how to think about the capability to stay, I think, is pretty fundamental to answering the question of what's required for people to feel they have a meaningful choice to stay and could imagine fulfilling their aspirations where they are. And having a lot of my fieldwork grounded in East Africa, I think an important component of that is not placing immobility and mobility as a binary, but really seeing how they can support each other, and thinking about rural and urban interconnections will be an important part of that answer. And under what conditions can internal migration substitute for international migration, I think it would be an interesting avenue to explore in the places where I'm working. But I also think the question and the relationship with violence is something that really came out of this panel that I found really interesting and kind of unexpected, the degree to which it also, I remember talking with someone in Ethiopia who works on issues of water, and she said, when there's conflict, we see people moving to flee the conflict and to, escape the direct threat of the conflict. But we see during droughts that people are not moving, we don't see the same degree of displacement. And of course, this was just an anecdotal comment, but it was quite striking to me because it made me think about, well, what do people expect to gain through their movement? And in a period of drought, one thing that was clear is moving to town, people weren't always certain that they'd be in a better situation, in the worst case, being homeless in the city, than if they stayed and were able to draw on their networks where they were and maintain a sense of dignity or government food aid. So I think these are some of the questions that were coming up for me as I was listening to some of the presentations. And then I think a missing dimension of that hasn't come out in our panel presentations too much is just the role of the labor market in driving migration trends from certain places, and looking at the migration system beyond just these origin countries, but where they're going. I love the way Felice got into state level effects at destination. I think as we can combine more and more of our understanding around migrant network effects, but also the demand for immigrant workers that still exists and is such a powerful driver of migration, then we can kind of look at those dynamics together with these drivers. So a few scattered thoughts. Felice, I'm not sure if you would like to address any of those questions.
Do you want to respond, Felice?
I'll just say one sentence. The interest in heterogeneity is basically trying to understand who is impacted in what way, and that could allow us to better address these things. I have a question for you, but I'll ask it offline.
Daniel, did you still have a question?
Thank you, Alex, and everybody. My name is Daniel Naujoks. I'm a professor here at Columbia teaching migration and refugee studies. I have a question for you, Alex. So the discussion on drivers and root causes and triggers, right, is very old. And many of us who have done, like my early research was all qualitative research. Now I'm coming to the dark side more and more. We know that survey questionnaires are highly limited, right? Like those questions asking somebody, okay, here's a list of 5 reasons why did you migrate? Was it work? Was it violence? Was it climate, right? And then we all know that this is highly problematic. And one thing you mentioned also, the context matters, many things that will not be always apparent in the outcome. So from your research, how does it feed into a broader critique of the survey literature, which then gives us maybe, because we have a huge discourse, right, about why do people migrate? Are they false? Are they economic refugees? Are they, even refugees might say, I want to work, right? I mean, so there's like, so how does it contribute to a broader critique of this survey methodology for finding the drivers or information on the drivers? And the second question, from your planned research and the interviews you were set to do you have already maybe some better questions, like even if just a small thing, like even in survey literature and surveys that could replace some of those more plain questions in the surveys that would give more nuance and that, again, from a climate perspective, would make it easier to identify where there are climate drivers in the responses?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing, and I think everybody in this room would agree, is not to start with a question around climate, because you're immediately going to, seed the idea that climate's, the desire to please the interviewer is always very high in some contexts, and so you just start. And so we had actually a really nice survey, I thought, that was, David and we had worked on together to basically try to get at more of these nuances of what's going on in your home, your family, and it was based on, Jürgen Carling's work. I know that, Carrie, you worked with him and other people who have really thought hard about how to get beneath these, at the layers of the onion that I put in that slide. I don't think there's any perfect way, and I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not saying survey research is useless. I was at a session earlier this morning where Forum I was presenting at the Mixed Migration Center. I have great respect for the work they're doing. I think we do need to know some of these, basic rationales and reasons why people are leaving areas, but we have to understand better what kind of context, what kind of answers people are actually potentially likely or able to give under certain circumstances. So that's part of what we want to do with this paper. We're already trying to do too much, but we'd like to, contribute to the broader discussion around what can we and can't we conclude from survey research, and when do verbatims and interviews with migrants in these longer form, like just letting people talk, I went to a MoMA exhibit a few years ago, and there was basically people narrating their journey, and they had like a pen, and they went on these maps, and they were drawing, and it was an artist who basically did this as a video art project. But I found it fascinating because they talked about, some of the stuff that was going on at origin, but these very long, what we call segmented journeys, where they're going from one country to the next, trying to find a safe journey, a safe route to their destination. So that was a good way to close, I think. Thank you, Daniel, for your question. Thank you to all the presenters. I thought this was a very rich session.